It began as a freak snowstorm. I've been hiking and camping in the woods outside of Kashmir since I was in high school. It was a spot I used to like to come to with my friends before they all got too busy to return to nature every now and again. The wilderness in North Georgia is just so beautiful. It's a great place to immerse yourself in nature and return to your roots. This weekend, however, I found myself at nature's mercy instead of its beauty. Well, maybe not nature. The longer I stay here, the more I suspect that something insidious might be in this place. When I set up my tent Friday afternoon, the temperature had been a little crisp, but nothing out of the ordinary. Spring has been in bloom, and it seemed unthinkable that it could get below 50 in the daytime. I had been meaning to hike deeper, coming back out again on Sunday, but when I woke up to find snow, I decided my weekend might be a bust. After gathering the gear I could find, I began hiking back to my truck, but I must have gotten turned around. As the day fretted out, I realized how lost I'd become. My usual landmarks were either covered in snow or changed so drastically that I didn't even recognize them. My compass was no help. The needle kept turning and turning, leading me in circles as I wandered through the snow. As I got more and more turned around, the night began to creep up on me. I was soon watching the sunset as I thought about whether or not to put up my tent or keep walking. And that was when I saw the light. It was small, like a candle on a windowsill. I'd never seen any houses out in the woods before, but it was possible that someone had built one in the 6 or 8 months since I had last been out here. I began heading in that direction, and as I did, I saw a cabin begin to materialize amidst the snow. A candle was burning on the windowsill, and as I approached, I began to look for signs of life. I saw no four-wheelers or any means of getting in and out. I was making sure to make a little noise, whistling and crunching loudly through the snow so as not to startle someone who might not want company. The cabin was not the sort of pre-made ones you sometimes saw in showrooms. It looked to have been made of sturdy trees, and the wood looked new and raw. Someone had built this recently, and it made me even more aware of whoever was inside. It was pretty likely that a gun lived there as well, and I was in no hurry to be a squib in the local paper. As I knocked on the door, I felt a little like Goldilocks trying to introduce myself to the three bears. I don't know what possessed me, but when no one answered, I tried the knob. It opened easily, and the door wasn't locked. So I stepped out of the snow to find a roaring fire in the grate of the one-bedroom cabin. It was humble. A bed, a table, a large bookshelf that seemed to stretch the length of one wall, some chairs, and the fireplace. It was so warm after having come out of the cold that I couldn't help myself. I stepped inside and made a beeline for the fireplace. I was careful not to track snow in, leaving my boots and pack on the front porch in the hopes that whoever lived there would recognize that I was here and not be startled. I don't know where the owner of the cabin was, but if they were out hunting in this weather, I wasn't likely to receive a warm welcome. Either way, I didn't think I had any options with the snow falling and the night fast approaching. I sat by the fire, and as the flames dried my clothes, I couldn't help but look at the huge bookshelf that stretched across the wall. It was floor to ceiling, and as big as it was, there was still space for more books. The books were numerous, about 30 in all, and their spines had the names of people instead of titles. My curiosity got the better of me, and I went and took the first one down. The name, Jeremy Blake, was printed in gold leaf on the spine, and when I opened it, it cracked in that satisfying way that old books do. The owner of the home probably wouldn't appreciate me perusing their bookshelf, but I figured I already had enough to apologize for. What was one more thing, right? The inside was written in what appeared to be real ink, and the handwriting was delicate and practiced. Whoever Jeremy Blake had been, he'd been a very dab hand when it came to writing. I had assumed it was biographical, but the book didn't look old enough to have been written in 1736, as it claimed on the front cover. Jeremy talked about being out hunting deer with his brothers when they were suddenly set upon by a snowstorm. It had been snowing when they set out, but they now found themselves in a real blizzard. His brothers had left him when he couldn't keep up, and Jeremy thought he was about to die. That's when he saw the light out in the woods. He talked about coming upon the cabin, and how it had seemed so empty, but lived in. Like me, he had decided to thank the owner when he returned, and set about pinning this in his journal, which he'd brought with him. I pray the snow passes quickly. I would love nothing more than to return to my father's home, so that I might chastise my brothers for leaving me in such a sorry state. The next entry, though, was a little bit different. Jeremy had woken up to find that no one had returned to the cabin, and the snow was still falling outside. He had thought it looked a little better, and now that he was warm, he thought he might try to make his way home again. Jeremy opened the door to leave, but upon stepping out, he'd walked right back into the cabin instead. He tried this several more times, but always found himself stepping back into the warm, inviting cabin. There was only one door. When he tried to break a window in his fervor, he found they would not break. He became a little bit upset, fearing that he had stumbled into some kind of deviltry. He tried to leap through the window and nearly knocked himself unconscious. He had destroyed the house, flipped over tables and thrown chairs, but none of them had broken. When he turned around, it had all resumed its previous position, and Jeremy was certain that he had found some sort of witch's den, and was most afraid. The next few days were full of entries about Jeremy continuing to live inside the cabin, and discovering what it was all about. He found that he didn't need to eat or drink, which was both a blessing and a curse. Despite not needing these things, he found that he was always hungry, and constantly licking his lips when his mouth felt dry. He watched from the window as the snow began to melt, and as winter became spring, he watched the animals roam outside the cabin. After a while, his entries became a journal of what he'd seen from the cabin's windows, until I discovered the last entry in this long series of observations. I don't know if anyone will ever read this. I suppose it matters not. I've existed in this house for a long, long time. I cannot say how long, but I was not even 15 when I came in out of the cold, and now when I look at the glass over the fire, I see an old man staring back at me. I don't know how much longer I'll survive, but today I saw another person for the first time in a long time. I was looking out the window, watching the snow fall again, when a child came hesitantly from the tree line. He was looking at the small candle that had brought me here, but his eyes got big when he saw me looking back at him. He took a step towards the house, meaning to come inside or ask who I was, but I shooed him away. I think now that I should have let him open the door to see if I could escape, but I couldn't take the chance of that boy being stuck here as well. Better to die alone here than have some young fellow watch me pass. He scampered away when I banged on the glass and yelled at him. Probably for the best. I'm going to stop now. This journal does nothing but remind me that I'm alive. Maybe it would be better to be dead. I wasn't sure what to make of the journal. Was it real, or some make-believe story the owner had concocted? I looked at the bookcase and wondered if they were all like that. It was getting dark outside, so I took the second journal over to the fireplace so I could read it in the roaring light of the fire. Pine knot cracked as I got comfortable, and the whole experience was very rustic. The handwriting was a little rougher, not the same as the beautiful script of the previous one. Inside were the musings of a woodcutter. His writing was shorter, more surface level. He'd gotten lost while chopping wood and found the cabin on his way home. He stopped in to see who lived there and got himself trapped inside, just like the writer before him. He'd used his axe to try to break free, but to no avail. He'd taken up the book he found on the shelf and began writing to pass the time. Wasn't much, 3 or 4 pages before he stopped. He wrote about watching some squirrels, seeing a deer, and worrying that he would starve when he didn't find any food in the cabin. Whether he died or became bored, I don't know. He stopped writing about 5 pages in, signing Roland Wood at the bottom. The same name on the book spine, written in the same rough gold leaf that the words were written in. The next diary turned out to be a kind of fantasy story, something my grandpa would have called an oat opera. It talked about pioneers on the trail, one of them breaking off in the night to have a call of nature. He finds a strange cabin with a flickering candle, and once he went in, it refused to turn him loose. He spent a few pages talking about being trapped in the cabin, and when his sister came to look for him, he saw her and banged on the window to get her attention. She looked up, clearly startled, and ran away before she could help him. Whether she'd seen him or not, no one ever came to look for him. The rest of the journal was spent telling the story of the pioneers and what they must have seen on the trail. His sister seemed to be the main character, and he talked about the Indians they fought, the animals they hunted, and the things they survived on the way to their new home. Eventually she married a man, and the two lived on the prairie with their growing family on the outskirts of Preacher's Glen. Towards the end, he must have become a little jaded with the whole thing, and the story took a dark turn. His sister, her husband, and her children became riddled with hardships as the Indians descended upon their house, burning their crops and killing them all. The sister watched her family suffer for the crime of leaving her brother behind. The journal ended with her finally being allowed to die at the hands of her captors. He signed it William T. Pitt on the last page, and when I looked up from the story, I realized it was day again. As snow rattled loudly against the window, I had to wonder if it had only been a day. Jeremy's journal made it clear that the concept of time was a little wobbly. Had I been here a day? A week? A year? The snow was still blowing outside, but it didn't have to be the same storm that had brought me here. I looked at the door as I got up to put the book away, and wondered if I would find myself stepping right back into the cabin. I took a step towards the door, but I wasn't bold enough to try it yet. I needed more research first. With little else to do, I picked up the 4th journal. I noticed that William Pitt was on the spine of the 3rd one as I put it back, and Beverly Stryker was on the spine of the one I took down. It seemed that the cabin had finally attracted a female resident, and I was interested in getting her point of view on the whole situation. Beverly's story was a little different from the others. Miss Stryker was in trouble when she found the cabin. Beverly had been fleeing into the night to escape her abusive husband. She hadn't wanted to marry him. He was not the sort of man that women like to marry, but she had made the mistake of falling for him when she was young, not realizing what a brute he was until it was too late. By then, her father had decided that if his youngest daughter wanted to marry someone so far below her station, then he would let her. He had enough useless mouths to feed, useless mouths in need of dowries, and her husband had asked relatively little from him by way of a dowry. The two had been wed less than a year when Beverly had run away for the first time. He had found her easily enough. Her husband was a hunter, and her trail had been easy to follow. He had his farm hands tie her up in the barn and whipped her with a horsewhip he used on the colts when they were breaking them in. Her skin had been covered in welts, broken and red from the lashing, and Beverly had been left in the barn overnight to think about what she'd done. She thought all right, but it wasn't likely the reflection her husband had been thinking of. Beverly lay in the filthy hay all night, thinking about her current situation and planning her next escape attempt. She played the dutiful wife for the next 3 months, filling his cup, cooking his dinner, and keeping his house like he liked, until her husband grew lazy again. He stopped having the hands watch her so closely. He stopped locking the bolts every night so she couldn't escape. He stopped putting the dogs out every night so they would alert him when she left. Then one night, she ran, but not fast enough. He was after her sooner than she expected, and she had heard the bang of the dogs and the clump, clump, clump of the horses' hooves. She was running through the woods, the early autumn chill sending goosebumps up her skin. She hadn't gotten dressed in anything heavier than a shift. If he'd caught her getting dressed, he'd have known she meant to run. So now she ran in the light of the late-year moon, her body bathed in the golden light as she fled for her life. When she had fallen, she had expected to be ridden down out of hand, but the hooves and the dogs went past her as she lay curled in the boughs beneath a tree. The roots made a kind of cage, Beverly looking through the bars as she listened to insects and night birds singing their song. She expected to be found, expected to be caught, but as the night deepened, she found it was only her out in the wilderness. The dancing light had stolen her from her worries, and that was when she noticed the candle. Beverly found the cabin and had been trapped by the enticing cage. There wasn't much after that. She'd written a little more, but nothing as exciting as the night run through the forest. She read the journals and discovered that she couldn't leave, but there was none of the fear or uncertainty the others had shown. She was content in this place, a place her husband couldn't find. She lived inside the cabin, updating the journal sparingly and passing away with nothing to show for it, and no one the wiser. I looked at the door again, but the next book looked so inviting. Books became my food. I devoured them, reading some of them and taking their stories in. The cabin had attracted many in its lifetime, and I wondered how many more had chosen not to write. How many had suffered in silence here? How many had simply wasted away with nothing to mark their passing, except their memories? Those who had written had left behind everything, from pages and pages of observation to short little stories about nothing at all. They wrote fantasies, westerns, slice-of-life stories about the people they'd left behind, and it all became more and more modern as time went on. I don't know how long I sat there reading, but it was snowing again when I looked up to find a journal in my hand with my own name on it. I opened it and found the pages as white and blank as the landscape outside my window. The doorknob was cold when I wrapped my hand around it. The wind was cold as it blew snow in through the open door. My boots were still on the porch, but they looked old and weather-beaten. The backpack was gone, likely dragged off by some animal while I was reading. The boots had been tan when I bought them less than a year before I entered the cabin. Now they looked bleached, the fabric thin as a mummy's cheek. I wanted to reach out and touch them, to see if my fingers would go through the thin skin of the boots, but I knew I would never get close to them. Stepped out onto the porch and found my foot coming down on the hardwood floor of the cabin. I closed the door and went back to the fire, picking up the journal with my name on it. If you're reading this, then it's already too late. I don't know if this place is supernatural or just some old pocket out of time, but I do know that it's a trap. I don't know if there's any escape from this place, but I know that no one's coming to look for me. I hope my diary is the last, but I have no doubt there will be others. The house seems to draw us to it, collecting stories as it collects lives. At least, I'll be warm before I die. I looked down at what I'd written, unsure of what else to say. It was barely a page, and the effort seemed lame. I was no writer. I'd never done more than emails or text messages. But as I struggled to find something to add to it, the futility of the exercise hit me all at once. If someone read it, they would be trapped anyway. My warning wouldn't help them, and my eyes slipped over to the fire as I thought about just burning it. Would it burn? I didn't know, but if the cabin wanted lives, then why give it what it wanted? Then I turned back to the door and thought of something a little different. An experiment might bear results. The book thumped onto the porch when I tossed it, and when I turned back to the bookshelf, it hadn't returned to its spot. The snow skittered across the pages, leaving wet runners on the paper as they marked them. They fluttered back and forth as the wind hit them, but the book was a little too heavy to be pushed by the wind. The snow seemed loath to come up on the porch, so I didn't think it would ruin it. When I closed the door, I hoped that someone would see it before they opened it. I had added a little bit at the end, and as I sat shivering by the fire, I hoped they would notice the book and follow the instructions before barging in. Knock 3 times and open the door. Under no circumstances come in. If the house is empty, run away as fast as you can. If I'm here, hopefully you can help me escape. I met my husband when we were in college together. I was working on my bachelor's degree, helping out in the library for some needed extra cash. When I first laid eyes on him, he was not the usual sort of man I fancied, more bookish than muscly. I found him charming in his own way, and we struck up a friendship. He told me he was a writer, that he was working on a book of short stories to submit to a publishing house. I offered to read them, and from that moment on, I became his biggest fan. His stories were so visceral. He wrote not as a writer, but as a first-hand observer, and it wasn't long before his work was noticed. We were living together by then, our library friendship having blossomed into something more, and I could see how giddy he was when the letters came in from Bowding Publishing. When he read how they wanted to publish his book, I think it was the proudest moment of his life. He kept writing for Bowding, his stories finding a niche with the horror community. He also started selling his pieces to magazines and online sources, getting his name out there and becoming more recognizable. As his fame grew, however, he still jokingly called me his biggest fan. I couldn't argue with him. I genuinely loved his work. He wrote the sort of stories that were genuinely terrifying and enticed the reader to keep reading until the very end. As his stories grew in number, I found myself curious about where they all came from. My husband, we'll call him Michael, was a mild-mannered fellow who had never really experienced anything horrifying in his life. He described his childhood as benign, no broken bones or funny uncles. His family was loving and doted on him constantly. He had never been without. He had never really suffered, and I found myself very curious about where all these nightmares came from in such a beautiful mind. Then, over drinks one night, he told me. He didn't like to talk about, where he got the stories from, not when he was sober. He always said that discussing the creative process was boring, or that his story's technical aspects would bore me to tears. I wasn't fooled, though. Beneath his jokes was something colder, something fearful. So one night I pressed him. He still didn't really want to talk about it, but I persisted. Finally, after a lot of coaxing and some strong whiskey, he all but blurted his answer to me. I wish now that I hadn't asked. "It's the door," he said, and at that moment he seemed almost afraid of his own words. "The door?" I was confused by the queerness of his answer. What do you dream about?" He asked the question so suddenly I was taken by surprise. "Oh, I don't know. Normal things, I guess. What I did the day before, movies I've watched, weird things my mind cooks up. I've only ever had the same dream my entire life. It's always the same. It never changes. It's where I get all my ideas." I leaned forward, intrigued by what he was telling me. He seemed emboldened by my attention. "The door lies in space. At least I believe it must be space. It floats in a great void, and every night I visit it. I float through this void naked, an umbilicus connecting me to whatever lies beyond. Every night I approach the door, and every night it whispers to me through the keyhole. Do you remember the little journal on my bedside?" I nodded, begging him to go on with my eyes. "I've trained myself to write the things I hear while sleeping. Sometimes I see pictures or faces when I look through the keyhole. Sometimes I hear terrible words spoken by creatures I imagine to be beyond my description. Sometimes I have to close my eyes and will myself awake because I'm afraid that the things they tell me will drive me insane. When I wake up, I read what I've written down, which becomes my stories." I was shocked. "So all your stories come from this big door in space?" He smiled at me. "It sounds silly when you say it like that, but yes, everything I've ever written was spoken to me by something on the other side of that door." I didn't think anything of it the next day. We'd been drunk, and he had just spouted off something to make me shut up. I was sure of it. I became more aware of his journal, though. Sometimes at night he would wake me up with the scritch-scratch of his pen on the page. I didn't like to look at him when he was writing it. It was like something otherworldly had taken his strings and was using him without his permission. Watching him write in that fugue state made me feel uncomfortable, and I took measures not to be awake while it was going on. I didn't think anything else of this, not until about 3 months ago. That was when he started having the nightmares. His work had always been creepy, always terrifying, but now it took on an alarming quality. He began talking about creatures that lived beyond the door. These creatures sounded more than a little Lovecraftian, and he was assured that their presence on Earth was an affront to the natural order. They came and went, their arrivals marked by some with great portents, and their battles had shaped history. The stories weren't the only thing that changed, though. He began to sleep poorly. His sleep had always been placid, peaceful, but now he thrashed and mumbled in his sleep. He whimpered in the night about the pale lady or the green man and the riotous red that surged like blood. The words he wrote in his journal were unreadable, a foreign language, but he sat and scribbled them, transcribed them every morning like a dutiful follower of some religion. He began to change. His eyes bore huge bags. He was jumpy and unsure of himself, and more than once I caught him catnapping fitfully during the day. His writing, however, was more in demand than ever. The magazines he wrote for wanted more stories about these strange old ones. His editor wanted to publish a compilation of them at once. He had no lack of material for the book, but I began to get worried about his health as he proceeded. We had been married for 2 years then, just starting to make a life together, and I was afraid that his candle would burn out before mine. I asked him one night to stop writing the stories. He was at his computer, typing away dutifully, when I made the request. He turned his head to look at me, haunted eyes boring into mine, and laughed for the first time in weeks. It wasn't his laugh, though. The laughter was jagged and full of despair, humor shared only by the damned. He laughed like a madman. I can't. If I stop writing, they won't like it. Who? I asked in confusion. The ones behind the door. They've marked me as their chronicler. I can't stop until the job is done. These things are killing you. Can't you see that, Michael? He slumped over his keyboard, resting his head against it, making a line of letters as he did so. Don't you think I would if I could? If I could stop, I would give so much to stop. The things they tell me, no one should have to know these things. It's fruit from the poison tree, and I wish I did not have the knowledge that they've given me. Then stop, I said suddenly. Just stop writing. Tell them you refuse to write their story. He looked horrified. Refuse them? I've never refused a story before. What if it stops the door from working? I turned him in his chair and pulled him to me. The door is in your mind, love. The way it manifests is nothing more than your own mind working through your stories. The monsters are of your own making. You control them. They don't control you. At that moment, he looked relieved. He hugged me back and seemed on the verge of tears. I don't think he had ever thought of those nightly excursions as anything but in a literal sense. He had never imagined that these things could be of his own creation, and the knowledge had made him feel free. I'll tell them tonight, then, he said with a smile on his face. I'll tell them that I don't want to write about them anymore. I'll tell Fred that I don't want to continue these stories in the morning. He won't like it, but he'll understand. He went to bed then, and I figured that would be the end of the nightmares. I was wrong. He woke me in the middle of the night, screaming. The back of his hand hit me in the face, and I rolled awake to the sound of him screaming. He was thrashing around, clutching his stomach and kicking his legs frantically. I tried to wake him. I know everything says not to do that, but I wanted him to wake up. I slapped his face. I threw water on him. I screamed his name, but nothing worked. Someone banged on the door, but I ignored them. I tried in every way I could to help my husband. Finally, he helped himself. We were in the ER. The knocking person had called the paramedics, and they had burst in. They thought someone was being murdered, but they loaded him up and took him straight to the hospital when they saw what was going on. He lay in an ER bed, screaming and kicking until they finally restrained him. He went right on thrashing and yelling until nearly 4 in the morning. Then he gasped loudly, like a diver coming up from a deep depth, and seemed to come awake. "They cut my umbilicus," he said in a tone of the most profound sorrow. They moved him upstairs later that day. The doctor who talked to him was afraid that he might hurt himself, and I was a little worried too. For the next 2 days, he sat strapped to a hospital bed, fighting sleep. He couldn't sleep, he told me, because he would have no way back without his umbilicus. I would be lost forever, and my consciousness would float forever in that void. He told me how he had told the thing behind the door that he would no longer write its story. I had assured him that it was all in his head, that it was a product of his imagination. When it had burst through the door and screamed, he knew it was all too real. He had run then, fled across the void, but the creature had wings and it had chased him. It defies description. Its legs were equine, its head like living rock. Its body was made of stars. I don't know, dear. Its mouth was full of fiery teeth, and when it lunged at me, I could do nothing but flee. As he had run, the thing had slashed at him. The clawed hand had torn at his umbilicus. Michael said a pain like a rending scythe had torn through his belly, and as he writhed, he could see the fiery teeth sever the root from him. He had caught the end then, using the last of his strength to grab the trailing end, and pulled himself out of the dark place, a little at a time. He was afraid after that, afraid to go back, afraid of what might be waiting there for him. He fought sleep for the next 3 days. He would nod and awaken, but it seemed harder for him to come back every time. He begged his doctor for caffeine pills, for coffee, for anything to keep him awake, but the doctors thought sleep would be the best drug for him. They fiddled with the idea of sedating him, but I forbade it. When they threatened to get the police involved, thinking I was somehow responsible for this, I threatened to call a lawyer. Finally, we reached a shaky standoff. It was moot after day 3. I lost the fight first, drifting off as I sat by his bedside. When I awoke, he was gone. He's in the ICU now. His coma is deep, and the doctors are afraid he might have suffered a stroke. They don't know about his nightly travels. Wouldn't believe me if I told them. But I know what's been happening to him. He's adrift in the void now, maybe already dead at the hands of this elder thing, and there's nothing I can do to get him back. But maybe there is something you all can do. My husband could not be the only one traveling to this place. Some of you must have heard the whispers through the door as well. If you see this door, and if you find my husband, please bring him back. I don't know how you would, but please try. And if the creatures on the other side of the door talk to you about things from the other side, please do yourself a favor and listen to them. Don't ever stop listening to them. I wish I had never told him to stop listening. The price you pay for ignoring them might be your life. The price might even be steeper than that. I looked at the ad, unsure if my fever-addled brain was reading it right. Wanted, someone to infect me with the COVID-19 virus. Must be verified as sick, have paperwork verifying illness no older than 2 days from today's date, and be willing to allow me to spend time near them. Will pay $500 for 8 hours in your company. Contraction of virus notwithstanding. Please email me immediately, with an email address attached. I had only been infected by the virus for the last 3 days, but I had been affected by it for the last 2 months. I had been laid off from work after a drop in profits had caused the store to go into bankruptcy. My boss had been very apologetic, but he still hadn't been able to keep the doors open. We had all hit the unemployment line after that, but unemployment wasn't as good as overtime. I'll admit, I had been living a little outside my means, and the bills were starting to pile up. Getting sick had ended my job search, and $500 was going to go a long way to settling my debt and keeping the lights on. And all that for letting a stranger hang out in my house for 8 hours sounded like a dream come true. I contacted him, and he offered to come over that very night, cash in hand. We discussed hours. I'm a dedicated night owl, and he agreed to come over at about 6 p.m. His knock dragged me out of my stupor at around 5:45, and I staggered up to get the door. I didn't expect to be greeted by a well-dressed man in his mid-30s. I'd expected a weirdo, maybe some disease fetishist who got off on being sick, but this guy was surprisingly well put together. He wore black slacks, a button-down shirt, no mask, and his brown hair was close-cropped with a square pair of little gold glasses that made him look like a banker. He shook my hand, something no one had done in a while, and took an envelope of money out of his pocket. He showed me 5 crisp $100 bills, and then I led him into the living room. He sat in my armchair, leaning in close as I sagged back onto the couch and stared at me intently. "So, what do we do now?" I asked. He shrugged. "Just whatever you usually do. Watch TV, play video games, whatever. Hopefully my proximity will be all it takes to get the disease, and I'll achieve my goal." "I had wondered about that," I said, sneezing into a Kleenex and wincing as he leaned in closer. "This disease is supposed to be pretty bad. Why exactly do you want it?" "I'd tell you, but honestly it would sound crazy," he said with a chuckle. I shrugged. "It's not like we got anything else to do but watch Netflix for 8 hours. Tell me, it'll make the time pass." He glanced over at my bookshelf, eyes roaming as though he was looking for something particular, before settling on and taking a paperback from the middle. It was a newer book, Fields of the Foregone, and he nodded as he inspected the spine. He must have liked what he saw because he smiled and held the book out to me. "I see you're a fan of my work. I'll sign it for you if you want, but my books are part of the reason I'm here." I squinted at him. Are you Timothy Corvin? The guy who writes the Ghostgrass series?" He nodded. "Yep, 3-time New York Times bestseller." I gaped at him for a few seconds before asking my next question. "Why the hell are you at my apartment trying to get sick?" He smiled, but the smile was sad. "You could say that the writing is why I'm here." He sat down again and made himself comfortable before telling me the strangest story I'd ever heard. "I got sick about a month ago. It came on quickly, cough, fever, typical flu-like symptoms, but I assured my agent that it wouldn't be an issue. I'd finish my latest novel and have it on her desk by the end of the month. First couple of days weren't so bad. I was still lucid, and I managed to get some work done. I was trucking right along, making good progress, when the real sickness hit. Suddenly I was feverish, scatterbrained, and I could hardly focus long enough to get off the couch. I spent my days in a stupor, high on cold medicine and barely coherent. My nights consisted of rolling around in a fever-fueled daze that made me question whether I was dreaming or awake. I had these dreams, you see. I say dreams because I can't remember them, but I couldn't do anything but remember them then. I would sit on the couch and mumble about them all day, reeling through their world as I tried to wrap my head around them. I raised an eyebrow at him. "It sounds pretty bad. Sounds like you didn't get a lot done." "Oh, quite the contrary. The longer I raved about the stories, the more I started to write about them. Not so much writing, I guess. I read through my notes the other day, and it was more like drunken ramblings. At some point, I moved on to chronicling them. I would come to at my computer, banging away at a story, not sure what I was doing or how long I'd been doing it. The stories were great, but they were so far outside of what I normally did that I couldn't wrap my incoherent brain around them. As the fever started getting worse, I would slip into these fugue states and just write for hours on end. One day I came out of one and found I had an email from my agent. I had sent her a draft for one of the stories. I was so worried. These stories were really weird, completely batty, and I was afraid that she would drop me as a client if she read what my fever-swallowed brain had cooked up. He took a sip from his coffee then, wetting his pipes, and my own fever-addled brain became a little impatient. "So, what did she think?" "Oh, she loved it. She said it was the most unique thing she had ever read, the most unique thing she had read in ages, and wanted to know when I was going to be done with it. Reading through what I had sent her and the stuff I was working on before I got better, I can see what she was talking about. It is both similar to so many things and completely different. It's a timeless story that sits completely outside of the normal processes. It seems to contain 2 antagonists and no hero, a war with nothing but loss and stakes that don't seem to make any sense. It was almost Lovecraftian, and I found myself as interested in hearing how it turned out as she was. But that was where the problem arose. He looked at my glass of water longingly, and I slid it across the table to him. If he wanted to get sick, then more power to him. He was paying after all, so he might as well get his money's worth. He reached out and brought it to his lips, throat working as he swallowed. I tried not to gag. There was probably backwash in that. My meds were squashing the fever that was keeping my brain in its altered state of mind. I was always careful never to ride it for too long, but the high was more than a little intoxicating. I would time travel in those moments, starting on my couch and coming to at my computer as I finished more pages than I'd ever done. I throttled back on my meds a little, wanting to stretch this out for as long as I could, but eventually my body started to get better. My fugue states became fewer and fewer. I found that I couldn't tap into that hidden world, and the story wasn't something that I could just make up as I went along. It was unknown, unheard of, and my mind couldn't begin to tap into that place by itself. My agent was wild to have more, wanting an ending, wanting a sequel, and that's when I started thinking about contracting it again. I lifted an eyebrow at him. I know that's what brought you here, that's what you told me on the phone, but I still have a hard time believing that you want this crap. It's miserable. Between the headaches and the near constant fever, I seem to mostly exist in a state of misery. Some people are experiencing it even worse than I have. What if you get the kind that's really bad and you're hospitalized? It seems like that would put a damper on your writing. He shrugged. That's the thing. Even when I'm experiencing the same symptoms as you, I still get the urge to write. I don't know if it's subconscious or what, but my brain takes over and forces my body to keep writing. Maybe it's not even my conscious mind. Maybe it's this place, and I've been tapped when I'm in these fugue states. I've had this thing 3 times now, you know. If I had had water in my hand, I would have probably did a spit take. 3 times? My God, you rarely hear of anybody getting it more than twice. After I got better the first time, I was struggling to keep up, he said, suddenly looking far away. I tried faking it, but it just wasn't the same. My agent started to notice. She started to send my stuff back with notes like, I need more of the voice you had in the first draft. I started getting desperate. She told me that she shared my notes with some of her colleagues, and they were very excited about how it was all coming together. So I started putting the pieces together and decided that I needed to recreate the situation. You needed to get sick again, I said. He nodded. I needed to get sick again. I started slowly, waiting in hospitals and waiting rooms, looking for sick people, but I became desperate after a while. I got lucky the first time, a chance encounter with a sick friend. One trip to their apartment, and I was back where I started, feverish and coughing on my couch as I waited for the time skips to start. Did they? Would I still be running the ad if they hadn't? This time, though, something was different. This time I was treated to some of the most vivid dreams I've ever had. I wasn't just hearing about my 2 antagonists. I could see them. I watched them play their shadow games, maneuver their pieces, snatch territory only to lose it again. All the while I was chronicling them. It became a mania for me. I refused to take anything to dull the fever this time, but it didn't seem to matter. After a week, my fever was abating, and I was back to trying to fake it. But I couldn't fake it. I wouldn't even try. I needed the dreams. I needed the visions. I needed the writing fits that I never remembered. That was when I started running the ads. The lady at the paper didn't want to run them at first. She said I was sick, but once I offered to pay her triple the going rate, she caved. As I watched him talk about it, I reflected that he did look pretty sick. Not physically, but mentally, I mean. He looked like an addict describing his favorite drug. As he talked, he scratched at his arm, his face taking on a smiling rictus as he described the visions. I began to wonder just how this disease, or maybe it was the story that had affected him. I wanted to tell him to leave off for his own good, but I really did need the money. I've sunk nearly $5,000 into getting this disease. Did I tell you that? Every time I post the ad, someone responds. After so many, though, my body has built up antibodies to it, and every time I get it, it's a little less effective. The last time I contracted it, I barely had it for a week. I was so anxious to get any work out of it that I don't think I got more than 30 pages the whole week. 30 pages? I gasped. I was no writer, but that seemed like a prolific amount of work for a sick person. I know, what a disgrace. The first time I was nearly averaging 30 pages a day, but after the first time I never managed it again. You were getting that much a day? His eyes glazed a little. He didn't seem pleased with what he saw, and he looked at my popcorn ceiling. I see them constantly. I simply can't make sense of it on my own. I can't convey something like storms battling for supremacy, tectonic plates crashing against each other as they try to change the land. Their fugues allow me to tap into something primal that could understand these ideas. My puny lizard brain just can't make anything out of it. You know, reading these things I've written, understanding only enough of what I've written, scares me a little. How much of your book have you written? I asked, not sure I wanted an answer. He scratched again, still uncomfortable, but wanting to discuss his drug of choice nonetheless. I've written 5 books. I've cataloged the lives of these two from the moment of their birth to the very last encounter they had directly. I gaped at him. He was talking about 5 books in what must have been a matter of months. I couldn't even consider something like that, and I began to wonder how large they were. The pages, the volume he was talking about per day surely meant that these were no small books. He didn't seem to understand where these stories were coming from either, which made them all the more mysterious and unknown. Can you tell me about them? He gave me a dead-eyed look, and I almost regretted asking. It's not something people really want to know in the end. This little experiment started as a way to write the next great fantasy series, but my agent stopped returning my emails about 3 weeks ago. The last 2 endeavors have been solely so I could learn how it ends, how we end. We? Humanity. We are the ultimate prize that these 2 creatures fight over. More specifically, they fight over the right to subjugate and entertain themselves with us. We see their battles as normal. We see their battles as nothing but the changing of the seasons, but they see them as nothing short of war. I can tell you, but you won't want to know once I'm done. I didn't really want to know anymore, but I felt like I had to know. In the end, my curiosity was stronger than my fear. He spent the next 10 hours telling me about the battle between the Green Man and the Pale Lady. He told me of their beginnings in Strange, their emergence, and their eventual exile, and how they came to be on this plane of existence in the first place. He told me about the Brandylow, the servants of the Pale Lady, and the numerous agents of the Green Man. He told me how this green warrior was worshipped as a pagan deity, how he took his sacrifices, and how he sought out those who ran. It's funny how 10 hours can seem like a half hour when someone is telling you about the eldritch deities that you never knew you wanted to know about. When the alarm on my phone went off, reminding me to take my meds, I realized that it was 6 a.m. and the sun was coming up. Timothy got up, checking his own phone, and seemed to realize that he'd been talking all night. Seems I've gone over my time a little. Here, as promised, he said, taking out the money and handing it to me as he left. Wait, I said, dropping the envelope and coming shakily from the couch. How does it end? He looked back and shrugged. Hopefully I'll find out. If I do, I'll let you know. Then he left, and I wouldn't hear from him for another 3 months. Well, I'd never hear from him again, but he would make good on his promise. I felt better by the end of the week, my fever breaking and my headache getting better and better. I finally acquired a negative test and started looking for work again. I got lucky. The bar up the road was hiring, and they needed someone to start right away. They had only recently been allowed to reopen, and the bartender was working double duty as the barback to help out. Before I knew it, I was bussing tables and hauling kegs like an old pro. I enjoyed the work, though it wasn't something I'd ever done before, and it felt nice to get back to work after a long absence. Then, one afternoon, I was helping my boss open, flipping on the TV and preparing to tune in to one of the sports channels like I often did. That's when I saw the little squib on the news that made me stop. The city is mourning the death of local writer Timothy Corvin, who died of COVID-related symptoms in St. Graham's this morning. Mr. Corvin, the writer of the Ghostgrass series, is survived by his father and his older sister. Service will be held Tuesday for his friends and family at... I couldn't believe it. The guy had been in my house not even a month ago. Had I killed him? Had he contracted his fatal disease from me? I had to sit down. I didn't know what to make of it. My boss must have noticed that something was off because he tried to send me home, wondering if I still had some latent symptoms of being sick. I told him I was fine, though, and I went back to work. As I worked, I wondered if he'd discovered the end he was looking for. I got my answer in the mail a couple of months later. A package was waiting on the stoop. I hadn't ordered anything, and the return address was from Samantha Drummond. The delivery address was mine, though, so I brought it inside and opened it. Inside was a manuscript, bound in twine with no title across the surface. On the top of the journal was a typed note from Mrs. Drummond informing me of her package's purpose. "Hello, my brother requested that I send this to you after he passed. He was very adamant that it be placed in your care. All the best, Mrs. Drummond." I lifted out the journal, opening the front page and bearing a message written in a shaky hand. "I found the end. Let's hope it helps you after I'm gone. I've been sitting here looking at the book for close to an hour, not sure whether I should read it or just burn it. If the beings Timothy had talked about had been using his infected body as a mouthpiece, I'm not sure I want to open my mind to them. This book contains their history, contains their past, present, and future, and this knowledge was gained at the cost of a life. Will they come to infect me if I subject myself to this arcane wisdom? That knowledge scares me more than a little as I put the journal back in the box and carry it to my room. I decided to put it in the closet for now. Some things are better left unknown, I think. "Mr. Fuller." The tall man looked up through the curtain of greasy black bangs, and his face was equal parts good-natured annoyance and unshakable certainty. Detective Cutter liked the annoyance. Annoyed men could become angry, and angry men could make mistakes. But the certainty was going to make this exchange difficult. A man who was certain was a man who would play the game to win, and Detective Cutter was just as certain that this man was guilty. "Do you know why you're here?" Cutter asked, and he put the box down between them as he stood leaning over Fuller. He could not have done this if Fuller was standing. Of course, if Fuller had been any further into 6 feet, he would have been playing basketball somewhere instead of writing crime novels. Cutter was all of 5 feet, and only because his red Irish curls put him over the limit. He stood over Fuller now, though, not glowering, but not smiling, from a position of power that Fuller's certain and almost bright smile did not seem to understand. The game was over in the 9th inning, Holmes, and now it was all over but the crying. Fuller looked up at him like a professor looking at a bright pupil who's just broken the cardinal rule and asked a foolish question. "Don't you know?" he asked in a deep, cultured voice that made Cutter want to start slapping him. "I assumed that you must have after 2 officers came to my office to collect me." "Collect you?" Cutter snorted. "Mr. Fuller, you were arrested, Mirandized, and placed in an interrogation room. I'd say that's about as far from collected as it gets." "Come on, Officer Cutter. We both know that if you could charge me with anything, we wouldn't be here having this little chat right now." Cutter grabbed the chair next to him and spun it so he could lean against the back as he sat. It was a distinctly juvenile posture, but he accepted it as he settled in for the long match. He was tired, bone-weary from chasing this guy's shadow for the last 3 weeks, and he'd be damned if he'd let him slip away now. Marcus Fuller was going to answer for these murders if he had to sit here all week, and Cutter was settling in for the long run. "My captain likes you for this. Hell, I like you for this, and we have solid evidence that if you didn't pull the trigger yourself, then you know who did." Fuller just rolled his eyes. "And why would I want to commit murder? I'm a very successful writer with 2 Sunday Times bestseller noir awards. I live very comfortably, and I could easily retire from writing after my next book and maintain that comfort for the rest of my life. Why would I jeopardize that by killing prostitutes and thugs?" "Let's talk about that prostitute, shall we?" Cutter said as he reached into the box and took a thick manila envelope out. He flipped it open onto 2 pictures of a pretty brunette in her early 40s. The top photo showed her inviting guests into a newly opened Royal Casino, while the bottom was her being booked a few years before for solicitation. Her expression was the same in both photos, devil-may-care attitude with a side order of iron poise. Marjorie Dyer, the proprietor of Dyer Needs, was found murdered in her suite at the Seawind Resort. He flipped the page, and behind it were several shots of a glassy-eyed Marjorie, who was no longer poised or so devil-may-care. She lay naked across a hotel bed, with a long, angry cut from one ear to the other, and a thick collar of blood clotting around the wound, making it hard to see. Hotel staff received a noise complaint about 11, and hotel security found her that way at 11:30. He had hoped the grisly scene would shock Fuller. He had hoped for revulsion, hoped Fuller would turn green or be sick in the wastebasket, or even that he would appear excited by the photos and tip his hand in front of the detective. Instead, he studied them for a moment and then looked back at Cutter expectantly. "Very graphic, Officer Cutter. What does this have to do with me?" Detective Cutter reached into the box as he spoke. "The murder scene of Marjorie Dyer is nearly the same as the killing of Catherine Hoff in your book Hunter City." He removed a dog-eared paperback from the box, and Fuller didn't seem at all surprised to see it. "If you'll indulge me, Mr. Fuller," and before Fuller could protest, Cutter had opened the book to the paragraph in question. "Hold her, Jack. I'm about to send Regis a message." As the switchblade came to life, Kat began to struggle between Jack and Anthony. Her tears made black pools of her mascara, and when Hunter lifted her chin to look her in the eye, she had long tracks down either side of her face. He waggled the blade in front of her, and she cringed away as the steel glinted in her eyes. "Please, Glenn, please don't do this. We can make a deal. I'll work for you instead of Regis, but please don't hurt me." And she dissolved into shuddering sobs again. She stopped when Hunter pressed the edge against her throat. "It's nothing personal, Kat. It's just business." She sighed like a split seam as the knife parted her flesh and her blood poured across the swell of her modest breasts. When Hunter's gentleman released her, she fell back onto the bed with a kind of boneless grace. Hunter only spared her a final glance before he strode into the hall and left her alone in his makeshift abattoir. Fuller indulged him as he read, and when Cutter finished, he only sat expectantly. "What do you make of that, Mr. Fuller?" Cutter asked, when it seemed Fuller would not break the silence. "Seems like a fan of my work decided to reenact some of his favorite scenes. As I told you the first time you came snooping around my office, I was at a charity event that night. A dozen people will corroborate that I was present until well past midnight. So unless I'm under arrest for writing a compelling crime drama, are you familiar with the murder of Gerald and Jamal Smith, Mr. Fuller?" Cutter cut him off mid-sentence. Men like Fuller hated to be cut off, and he felt confident that the act would unnerve him. "It didn't." "I'm afraid I'm not," Fuller said, crossing his arms and appraising Detective Cutter with light disapproval. They were hired muscle for Selectman Kane, a local crime boss in the area, all three of whom also bear a striking resemblance to Boyle, Barker, and Regis Angel from Hunter Street. Fuller rolled his eyes and sighed deeply in his throat. "Do tell." Both Gerald and Jamal were visiting a tavern below Kane's office when their drinks were spiked with Rohypnol. Both were large men, Mr. Fuller, and both had a lot of experience with guns, as did Boyle and Barker. Boyle and Barker, as you recall, were drugged by Glenn Hunter before he assailed the home of Regis Angel. Both sets were shot on the stairs as they tried to return to their boss. Their nerves dulled, they were easy prey for both Glenn Hunter and our current mystery killer. Then, of course, there's the nature of Selectman Kane's death. "Let me guess," said Fuller. "Drowned in the bath?" Cutter flipped through the file and settled it back on the table. "Close. Drowned in the sink." The photos were of a man in his late 50s, lying face up in a utility sink. His shoulders had been forced down into the wide basin, and his face was a spiderweb of cuts and scratches where the faucet had battered him. One of his eyes bulged grotesquely, as the other stared glassily at the photographer. Fuller looked at this with no more interest than he had the others, and when he looked up, his eyes questioned Cutter on what he hoped to accomplish. He didn't catch Selectman Kane in the bath. He was forced to improvise by drowning him in a utility sink. Kane fought, but forensics says his attacker finally broke his back and forced him down into the utility sink to properly drown him. "That's not from one of my books, Officer Cutter, as well you know." No, but Hunter did drown Regis in a bathtub after killing his bodyguards in a stairwell. I got the passage somewhere here. He removed his copy of Hunter Street from the box as well. He turned to the back and saw Fuller wince as he bent the pages back to read the highlighted paragraph. That's more of a reaction than he had given to the entire photo album, Cutter thought, as his eyes found the spot. Hunter watched as Wagner's eyes went wide as he pushed through the bathroom door. Wagner reached for the gun in his jacket, but the little silenced pistol in Hunter's hand woofed softly. He felt the angry burn as the acoustics of the bathroom turned the Rise of the Valkyries into a cover for the loud, wet slap of the body as it hit the floor. Hunter entered the small door between the bathroom and the washroom unnoticed. As he pushed the large form of Regis Angel under the water, he was rewarded with total surprise. The old man was still quite strong, and had it not been for the surprise of the attack and the slippery bathtub in which he was lounging, Hunter thought that he would have been in for a real fight. As he drowned him, he bent over him so he could watch the life leave his eyes. If you watch a powerful man draw his last breath, some of his spirit will be transferred to you, boy. His grandfather had told him this 1,000 times if he told him once. As the struggling stopped and the great shadow of Regis Angel left the world, however, Hunter felt little save the deep sense of satisfaction and a staggering sense of loss. "You're reaching, Detective," Fuller scoffed, but Cutter noticed the change in title, and it seemed a victory, if a small one. "He was drowned on his back, Mr. Fuller, which leads us to believe his attacker wanted to watch him die." "Which supports the theory of a copycat," Fuller barked, pushing up from his seat to glower at Cutter. "Just because you beat this dead horse over and over again, Detective, does not mean it's going to give you anything but... Your third book was a bit of a disappointment, wouldn't you say, Mr. Fuller?" That shut him right up. He stopped mid-sentence and goggled at Cutter, as if he couldn't believe what he just heard. If Fuller wanted to play the copycat game, Cutter was ready to drop his final bit of damning evidence. He was more than happy to let Fuller back himself into the corner first, though. Fuller blew out a long breath. "I don't see how that's relevant at all to your case." "A dozen rewrites, not well received by the fans, and the reception at the ending was bad enough that you had to write a fourth book and turn the Hunter trilogy into a Hunter quartet. That had to sting a little, wouldn't you say?" That was a decision I made on my own," he snapped, but Cutter didn't care. He had this guy, and he knew it. The first two pieces were only appetizers, and after he served up the main course, he'd be more than happy to give this guy his just desserts. "Well, the most recent murder was very reminiscent of another scene from your book." "Oh, please do tell. Someone kill a big stupid brute on the street with a machine gun? Poison a congressman? Maybe slit a whore up the..." Cutter threw down an open folder and watched the pompous prick deflate like an old balloon. "We had to request the manuscript from his secretary when we found out you had written a fourth novel. She was so distraught that she sent it over immediately. This, Mr. Fuller, is the reason you're here." Fuller looked far more unsettled by these photos than anything else that day. This can't be. I just talked to Dan last week. Danforth Wilde was murdered in his apartment last week, 3 days after you threatened him over social media for stealing the premise of Hunter State for his noir series. You said you would make him regret every word he published, didn't you? I guess maybe he regrets it now, doesn't he? Fuller sat, looking at the pages for several seconds, before closing his eyes and sighing. He was eviscerated, just like the congressman in Hunter's stand. My agent was the only one who had a copy of the manuscript, so of course, you think... He closed the folder and glared at Cutter. "Hook me to a lie detector, Detective. Call my assistant and ask her where I was when Dan was killed. I have no receipts for travel, I have taken no leave from work, and you will find no way I could have done these things. Now, unless you're prepared to hold me under suspicion, I demand that you release me." Cutter stared at him for nearly a minute before shaking his head with a deep sigh. He had hoped he could grill the answers out of Fuller, but the guy was too slick for that. His captain was going to rake him over the coals for this one, and Cutter could already hear the sounds of pens signing his leave of absence. "Go then," he said, waving his hand at the door, and Fuller left with a little slam as the door shut behind him. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of suspension from duty. Cutter drained the whiskey from his glass and slid it back towards Mike. He had had his first drink right here at the Fighting Cock, and he suspected it would be where he took his last. You shake enough trees like he had, and you were bound to have something fall on you eventually. Guys like Fuller, though, they made him ache for a drink. The door jingled, and Cutter didn't even look up as someone plopped down next to him. They thought I might find you here, said a familiar, cultured voice. I need your help. Cutter blew a chuckle into his shot as he knocked it back. You dance around justice, get me suspended for 3 weeks, and expect me to... He flinched a little when he looked at him. Fuller had a long, jagged cut across his face, and his left eye looked like a few more punches would have broken the socket. He caught Mike's eye, and the barman seemed to be trying to decide whether to call the police or let Cutter handle this. In the end, he offered him a rag from behind the bar and slouched off out of earshot. Fuller sat down next to him, and his eyes darted towards the door like a trapped animal. I need you to protect me. The man who's been murdering these people has been staying with me for several months now. He's also responsible for the 4th Hunter book, and until tonight, I thought his killings were something benign, a way to clean up the streets, if you will. When I confronted him about Dan, though, he just went crazy and tried to kill me in my apartment. Slow down, said Cutter, as he took a pad from his pocket. Let me get some information first. He wobbled a little on his stool as the alcohol settled over him like a cloud. The shots were beginning to catch up with him, but he wanted to be sure he got everything verbatim. If he could bring this information to his captain, then maybe they'd rescind his suspension. Let's start with a name. Who tried to kill you? Fuller took a deep breath before saying the last name Cutter would have ever expected. Glenn Hunter. When my parents told me I was going to be sent to take care of my great-grandfather, I was very hesitant. My great-grandfather, Iman Franger, celebrated his 110th birthday in December. Not that anyone had been invited to his party. Actually, there had been no party, because my great-grandfather was a shut-in. He was a famous horror writer, writing and publishing stories since the turn of the century, and he was supposed to have a small fortune saved up. As such, he lived in a Mary Shelley-style house out in the middle of nowhere, toiling away at his latest work of terror. My mother had 5 sisters, and all of them had been trying to get the highly coveted spot in Great-Grandpa's will. But so far, none of my cousins had managed it. It wasn't like I wanted any of his money, but Mom was insistent. She had been after Great-Granddad's money, just like her sisters, since her early adulthood, and now it seemed that her time had finally come around. Since all my other cousins had struck out, this seemed to be her chance. She told me to go and spend the summer and maybe some of the fall with him, and see how things worked out. Bring some of your writings with you. Maybe that'll get you in good with the old man. And that was how I came to be on my great-grandfather's porch in mid-May, preparing to stay until nearly Halloween. The house was an old 3-story that I knew was nearly a mansion from the few times I'd been there as a kid. There were 8 rooms, 5 bathrooms, a kitchen, a study, and of course, my great-grandfather's office on the 3rd floor. Sometimes you could see him through the large bay window as he sat up there, hard at work at the old typewriter he favored. He had once sat close to the window so that he could look out and perhaps be inspired by the forests or the lawns that surrounded his property. Now, it appeared, he preferred a spot away from such distractions. I rang the doorbell and was unsurprised to hear the lock click open electronically. Great-grandpa kept no staff. Before I'd been born, a few of his caretakers had turned up missing, and after several searches of the home and property, Great-grandpa had finally just dismissed his staff and lived alone. He had mostly relied on the kindness of his relatives, or just done without for most of my life. He was very reclusive, and I wasn't really looking forward to spending the next 6 months in his company. I'd been preparing a manuscript to send off for publication, and I figured that I would have little time for revisions if I was too busy tending to my aging grandsire and his monstrous house. Looking back on it now, I see that I really had no idea what was in store for me. The house had a musty look to it, like some old Gothic construction from one of Great-grandfather's novels. I don't know if this was intentional, but it gave the place a very uncared-for look. I had to wonder what my cousin Leslie had actually done here when he stayed for 8 months last year. The floors were dusty, the drapes in the kitchen were growing a fine crop of mold from a leaky window, and the whole place just had a very dank smell about it. Given the house's age, this was no surprise. The house was well over 100 years old, and had been both my great-grandfather and my grandfather's ancestral home. Now, it was little more than a hulking relic that sat waiting for my great-grandfather to die so some construction company could turn it into a strip mall. A speaker crackled in the foyer, and the buzzing sound made me jump a foot.
"Don't just stand around counting the silver. Come up to my study. I have orders for you."
Even at 110, it sounded as though he hadn't lost the steel in his voice. So I climbed up the 3 flights of stairs, wondering how my great-grandfather made it up and down these stairs every day. He must come down to eat, I reflected. He hadn't had anyone to help him since Leslie had left 6 months ago. As my young, sturdy legs made the climb up the creaky old boards, I reflected that I was nearly winded as I came to the 2nd floor landing. I would soon become quite intimate with those steps in the months to come, though. My grandfather sat in the topmost room, a room that had once been the attic. The 2nd set of stairs had been built just for him, and they were steeper than the original set by far. As I came up the stairs, I could see my grandfather's desk and the battered old wingback chair he had owned since I was a child. The desk and the chair sat in profile, and it was like a scene from a movie. The camera would start a slow pan in and mount the stairs, and the audience would see the back of the red upholstered chair and hear the clicking of the keys. He sat hunkered there like a gargoyle, arthritic fingers tapping away at the keys of his old battered typewriter. The sound was skeletal somehow, like bones against ivory. He kept right on clocking away as I stood a respectful distance behind his chair, not wanting to get off on the wrong foot with this ancient writer that I must share quarters with for the next few months. The attic room was the size of a normal studio apartment and appeared almost Spartan in its furnishings. There was a bed, small and neat, several sagging old bookcases that looked equally as infected with mold, a rug that stretched from the landing to his dark mahogany desk, which sat ever facing into the corner. He had once faced it towards the large picturesque window that looked over his property, but now it looked only into the corner, as though someone had put my ancient grandsire in time out.
"I understand that you are to be my new caretaker."
I jumped a little, the clicking leading me to believe that he would go right on ignoring me for a little while longer. His voice was creaky, raspy from lack of use. I expected to see dust puff out from behind the chair, and when he turned, I decided that my expectations hadn't been far off. To call my great-grandfather ancient would have missed the mark. The man was shrunken to the point of elvishness. He could not have been more than 4 feet tall, and his arms and legs looked shrunken and childlike. His arms were held out in front of him, hands held down at the wrists in a way that made me wonder how much it must hurt him to ride on. His legs hung an inch above the floor as he sat in that monstrous chair, and I remember thinking that he looked like a child sitting in his father's seat. The image was more grotesque than humorous, however.
"You should know that I have high expectations for my helpers. I give no special treatment for family members. Your life here will be hard, but focus on the silver lining. You might just manage to acquire that oh-so-coveted spot in my will that my children and my children's children and now my children's children's children seem so incapable of garnering. Anything is possible, I suppose." And when he shrugged his shoulders, I imagined that I could hear them grind together. Listening to him talk was like watching a particularly talented bit of ventriloquism. His accent was plummy, cultured, and far too deep for the child-sized creature residing in that throne. I expected someone to poke their head out from the back of the chair any minute now, and laugh, saying how they had gotten me. When we both ended up staring at each other for the next few seconds, and no grand revelation was revealed, he went on. He told me about his meal schedule first. He ate breakfast at 5, lunch at 11, and dinner at 6. He subsided almost entirely on Campbell's soup, of which he had a large supply in the pantry. There were 7 different flavors of soup, one for each day of the week, and every month there was a number I would call to have more delivered. He told me that I could make a list of food I wanted as well, and that they would be delivering it to the house with the order. "Just keep the bill under $500 a month, he droned. "I would like to remain in funds until I die."
He bathed every night at 7. While he assured me that he didn't need help bathing, he would need help getting to the bathroom, into the tub, out of the tub, and back to his room. I was to put him in the tub and then leave until summoned again. He would be fully dressed again, and when I arrived, I would help him back to his room. His schedule, other than that, seemed to be writing. He wrote sometimes for 18 or 19 hours a day, and would often write well into the night if the mood took him. He rarely slept, he told me, and I would likely find him napping in his chair if I needed something early in the morning. He slept most often between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. I was not to disturb him or make any noise between those hours whatsoever.
When you're my age, you find you just don't need to sleep as much as normal people. But I won't have the little that I do get disturbed by your needless clatter.
My duties, other than feeding and bath time, were my own.
I would like the house swept once a week, the windows opened once a week to air out the dust, the drapes taken down and washed once a month. I have a sneaking suspicion that feckless cousin of yours didn't accomplish any of these things, so it's likely a mess down there. I do not own a TV, nor do I have internet. There is a phone in the kitchen that you may use if you should need to, and while I do have electricity, I expect you to turn the lights off behind yourself. I seem to recall that your cousin Winifred racked up a $400 power bill while staying here, and I ejected her for it. So long as you follow my rules and keep the house, I suspect I will ignore you for your stay here, and you will have no hardships.
He dismissed me after that, and thus began my time in my great-grandfather's house, a time I would come, in later years, to regret undertaking. It first began with the typing. My grandsire hadn't lied. He wrote 18 or 19 hours a day, and the keys of his typewriter were loud. You could hear him typing away from anywhere in the house, and the noise became a constant background drone. Using my hotspot on my phone, I was able to get some writing done, and my proofreading was coming along very well. It was slow, and the signal out here was poor at best, but I plucked away at it as dutiful as I could, despite the distracting sound of all that clacking. The sound almost seemed to scuttle, worming its way into your ears like phantom fingers as you sat trying to concentrate. I tried playing music. I tried using earbuds, but no matter how high the volume, the sound seemed to clatter against my senses like a badly played piano. I began to become rather sympathetic for a certain Poe character, having my own telltale heart clattering at all hours of the night. On sunny days, I would even take my laptop out onto the lawn and get some work done. Though it defied all logic, I imagined that I could hear that typewriter, even on the porch, or on the way to the mailbox down the lane, easily a half-mile from the house. I know how it sounds, but I also know what I heard, and it invaded not just my waking hours, but my resting hours as well. That's also how the dreams started. Sometimes I would dream that it was me sitting in that big old chair, typing away for hours on end as the words just came sliding up the paper. In my dream, the paper was never ending. It simply rolled on and on as it came out of the typewriter. The words rose like a tree in the forest before my very eyes. My fingers would clack endlessly on the keyboard, my young, strong digits becoming withered like great-grandfathers as I typed my life away. I was always in front of that big bay window as I worked, watching the fireflies out in the woods as they frolicked. Sometimes, though, I would catch a glimpse of myself in the mirrored glass and jolt awake as my great-grandfather's face looked back at me. Then there was the whispering. The whispering had likely been there from the start, but I didn't pick up on it for several weeks. Great-grandpa didn't own a vacuum, so I was stuck sweeping the floors and taking the drapes outside to beat them with a broom. Fortunately for me, carpets were not all the rage at the turn of the century, and Great-grandpa had hardwood floors throughout. I was sweeping the second floor when I heard a spidery whisper coming from the stairs at the end of the hallway. It was nearly unintelligible, the voice the thinnest of whispers, but my great-grandfather was unable to match it in his response.
I won't. You can't make me. You don't even know if he could take my place. It doesn't matter. I won't curse him with the same life I've been cursed with. Stop whispering in my ear and let me finish.
Then came the loud crash of keys resumed, and Grandpa ignored whoever had been whispering to him. I thought about it as I swept, unsure what to make of it. Who had he been talking to? More importantly, who had he been talking about? I knew that he had no phone up there. If he needed something, he always called down the stairs, and the whispering had sounded like it was coming from right inside the room as opposed to a phone. I shook it off as the senile ramblings of the old and troubled man and went about my chores, wanting to get them done so I could return to my own work. That was the first time, but it wouldn't be the last time I heard those whispers. I began to hear them in more than just Grandpa's study as well. They began as something like the scrabbling of mouse feet, a skittery noise that scrabbled across my senses sometimes. The longer I listened, the more I heard, and what I heard was frightening. They whispered about far-off places and foreign hellscapes. They whispered about terrible devils and ancient evils, all of which would win in the end, despite the hero's best efforts. I heard them sometimes in my sleep, a place I could not escape them, and they often filled my dreams with terrible prophecy. The work was literally the third indication that something was amiss. While Grandpa's genre had always been horror, I was more interested in fantasy and YA. My current manuscript was a puff piece, something to get my name on the desk of an agent or a publisher so I could work on more groundbreaking fantasy. My story was good, warring vampire clans and a romance that was trying to blossom amidst the chaos, but it was nothing new. It was a safe bit of YA pseudo-fantasy, the kind that had a built-in audience and was fairly safe. The longer I worked on it inside Grandpa's house, though, the darker the story began to become. Characters began to die more often, backstories became less teen-friendly, and a shadow fell across what had been a fairly light little book up until that point. A lot of my time seemed to be spent fixing changes I had made the day before, and I was getting frustrated with the shifts in tone that seemed to be trying to take place in my story. It was as though someone was also whispering in my ear, telling me to spill blood or inject horror where none was needed. I found my mind wanting to write things that I'd never been interested in before, and the feeling made me uneasy. Then, one morning, I woke up to find my great-grandfather reading some of my editions from the other side of the table. I had fallen asleep at the keys, and when I woke up, I saw his spindly arms scrolling down as he read. It was clear he didn't like using the computer. He made a face every time he had to touch the keyboard, as if putting his fingers on it was something unpleasant. And when he saw me noticing him, he turned the computer back towards me. Then, he did something I'd never seen him do in all the years I'd known him. He smiled.
"You write well, boy. It's a little fluffy for my taste, but it appears that I'm not your target audience. How long have you been writing it?"
I told him I'd been writing my current work for about a year, but I'd been writing in general for most of my life. He nodded, seeming to like the taste of this new information.
"Thought I was the only one, at least since your Uncle Stephen passed."
Then he slid out of the chair, his feet barely making a sound as they touched the floor, and ambled back upstairs. After that, I seemed to notice him hovering around the dining room often as I made corrections and changes to my manuscript. At first I tried to ignore him, not wanting to make it awkward, but as the weeks tripped by, I asked if he'd like to come help me with my revisions. He declined at first, saying he needed to get back to work. But over time, he actually came to sit with me and helped me labor through the 500 pages of tween trash, as he often called it. Every new revision, the darker ones at least, seemed to interest him, and I found myself taking his suggestions more than I rejected them. Then, one day around Halloween, he invited me to his study. He said there was something he needed to show me. He was standing by the gigantic wingback chair when I arrived. He looked even more like an underfed child as he slid a hand over the arm, his head only slightly taller than the arm of the chair itself.
"You've impressed me, son. Your writing is a little rough, but I suppose that all writing looks rough after a century of it. Many people have asked me how I've lived so long, and writing is the secret to my success. The writing, however, is only half of it. The other half is this." He stroked the chair again as he said it, a look between loathing and loving crossing his face. "Your chair?" I asked skeptically. "Not my chair. This chair was never mine. It was loaned to me on the grounds that I use it for its intended purpose."
"And what purpose is that?" I asked, feeling the hair on the back of my neck prickle.
"Terror," he answered.
I almost expected to hear thunder rumble outside as he made this exclamation. "The chair is meant to spread terror?" I said, trying to keep the skepticism out of my voice. Great-grandpa didn't seem to notice. He just kept looking at the chair in that loathsomely fascinating way he had. The chair seemed to have him under its sway, and he was powerless to cleave from it.
"The chair is a conduit. Its purpose is simple, to spread fear and to propagate terror. You've heard the whispers by now, I'm sure."
I nodded, hearing them scurry across me even now, as I watched my grandfather stroke the old chair that suddenly seemed to be shallowly respirating before my eyes.
"From the second I read the changes to your manuscript, I knew it had gotten in your head. It calls to you, just as it called to me, and now it wants to make a deal."
I took a step back from the chair. "What are you talking about? A deal? What sort of deal?"
"You can write forever. Write as much as you want, and your work will make you the kind of money that puts normal men to shame. All you must do is sit in this chair and let it work through you. You can do that, can't you?"
I wanted to refuse him, this grinning skeleton in his slowly, but now visibly respirating chair. The longer I looked at it, the more I could see the baleful eyes, the fanning nostrils that were almost snake-like, the grinning mouth that sat in the seat. It looked at me, and as much as I wanted to deny what he was saying as the ramblings of a crazy old man, I couldn't. The chair's glamour had slipped away, and now I could see the monster that lay beneath.
"Come sit," he beckoned. "Come sit and let it show you its power."
I didn't want to. Sitting on that thing was the last thing I wanted to do, but I found my legs had other ideas. I had moved as if by magic, my legs that of a puppet's on strings. I expressed all my will, but I was a child resisting a hurricane. Great-grandfather moved aside as I came before his throne, and when my bottom slid into that hoary old thing, I expected the teeth to gobble me up. Instead, I was filled with something unexpected. I was filled with completion, a sense of homecoming. I was complete. I saw myself reach for the typewriter, as I had done in my dreams. The whispering beckoned me to write, compelling me to spill my talent for it, and I obliged. The words rolled from me. They weren't mine, not mine at all, but they oozed from my fingers like blood. My words became the click-clacking of the keys. My mind was a chalkboard fit only to be wiped and filled again and again. I was taken over, possessed, and the demon of inspiration capered through me. There was no endless paper now, but I saw the sheets filled and refilled again and again, made full only to be exchanged by another, and as I looked down at the ivory keys, I felt my sanity reassert itself as I saw the stains on that virgin ivory. They were dark, old blood, but they would surely be wetted again. I don't remember passing out, but I remember waking up. I was lying on the bed in my great-grandfather's study. He was sitting on the edge of it, looking even more childlike as his legs dangled. It occurred to me how infrequently I saw him away from his keyboard in all the months I'd been here, and he looked both forlorn and greatly relieved as he watched his withered feet swing.
"You did quite well. The first 300 pages of a manuscript that will soon grace the New York Times bestseller list, I'm certain. At least, my agent seems to think so. I never have much of a head for popular fiction." "What?"
But I realized I didn't know what to ask.
"It kicks like a mule, don't it, son? I remember the first time I experienced it, back in 36, or was it 26? Who can remember? I was edging towards middle age then, kids out of the house and off on their own, and your great-grandmother had just died of a sudden pneumonia. I was alone in this mausoleum, sure that I had maybe one book in me, but unsure of how to coax it out. The man I bought the chair from showed up out of nowhere, showed up as if I had summoned him, and said he had just what I was looking for. Then he showed me this ghastly hulk you see crouching over there, and I was highly skeptical. My eyebrows slid up even more when he said that it had already been paid for.
He got a dreamy look on his face, as though his mind was casting back through time.
He told me that all I had to do was write, just write, and the chair would do the rest. He told me that the chair would take my writing into heights that no one had ever dared hope, and all I had to do was shake his hand. When I sat down to begin, the man tipped his hat and grinned like an imp. I never looked back. At first, it was thrilling, churning out stories, books, whole series over the course of years. I was detailing my legacy at a breakneck speed. I was like a dragon, looking up to see decades pass by as I sat before my window. His dreamy look became melancholy then, his toes flapping bonelessly as his legs rose and fell like lunatic jackstraws. This is my legacy, boy. This is the inheritance that all my children and all my grandchildren and all my great-grandchildren have struggled for. The money, the house, the land, none of it matters. My inheritance is that chair and that typewriter and a legacy of stunning horror. It is a mantle, and if you chose not to take it up, I would understand. But, and I know from experience, if you don't take it up, you'll drive yourself crazy thinking about what could have been. You'll wonder if the success you have couldn't have been greater, if the joy you felt could not have been more, and if your years upon the earth could not have been better spent.
He looked at me then with such naked hope that I realized what it would mean if I took this burden from him. He would die, but it seemed he was ready to die. His legacy would be mine. The paper would say that the talent ran in the family, and it would continue to run until I passed it on or fell to dust. In the end, I can't even say that I did what I did to save my great-grandfather from his continued suffering. In the end, I did it because he was right. If I didn't do it, I would always wonder what if. He extended his hand to me.
The papers are signed and sitting on my desk. The house, the land, it's all yours. Everything. And everything that comes with it, he emphasized. I'm proud to say that my hand didn't shake as I took his. On the third pump of his arm, my great-grandfather turned to dust, and I was left to sit and watch him scatter across the place he loved so much. Then I took my place in the mouth of that great beast and began to write. I would continue to do so for a very long time. It's been so long since I watched my grandsire dissolve before my eyes. In that time, I've been the most prolific horror writer of my age. I've built up money like some old dragon, sitting on my wealth as I hunker on my hill. Sometimes my relatives come to see me, but most times they don't. My own mother refused to talk to me after great-grandfather left everything to me in his will, but I hardly noticed. She died a few years ago, or was it a few decades? I didn't attend the funeral. Being away from my work for too long makes the whispers less quiet. I travel some, as my grandfather must have done in the beginning, but I never stay away for long. The stories must be told, the conduit must be maintained, and I must remain the keeper of this black lighthouse. It takes a toll, though, to be certain. I understand why my great-grandfather slept so little. If I cannot continue to expel this darkness, it pools inside me, and the vivid nightmares often bring me screaming back to reality. The bags under my eyes have become luggage, and yesterday I glanced up into the window and thought I'd seen a ghost. The old man that looked out from it was withered and sunken, and I thought that great-grandpa's ghost had returned to torment me. I see now why great-grandfather moved into the corner after a time. I'm not entirely alone, though. My cousins have gone on to have children of their own, and sometimes they send them to me, as I was once sent. One of them, a girl named Katie, is on her way now. I've heard that Katie is a rather prolific poet, and said to be quite talented. We shall see what the chair makes of her. Who knows? Perhaps I might be allowed to stop too before long, and bask in the comfortable blackness that awaits me as well.
Travis pulled up in front of the old cabin, ready to prepare everything for the coming weekend. It would be nice to have the rental property again. It had been closed for the last 8 months as the police combed over every square foot for evidence. Travis grimaced as he thought of it, cursing his luck at being out all that cash. He'd had a funny feeling about that writer type, but he'd needed the money. It had been a slow season, and he needed to make it up before the snows came. Who would have known that the snows would come early that year? As he pulled up, Travis saw that the place looked completely untouched, except for the police tape that crisscrossed the door. As he broke the tape and the door came open, he breathed in the dust of the last few months. Travis had been here only a few times since the investigation had begun. They had been searching the woods mostly, searching for the man who had been on the New York Times bestseller list for about 6 months a few years ago. He had disappeared sometime during the blizzard, and no one had any idea where he was. Travis didn't much care if some city boy had wandered off during a storm, but he hoped it wouldn't be something he'd have to tell people. It would hurt his chances of renting the cabin again. Travis grimaced as he saw the place, realizing that this would be more work than he thought. The front door was supposed to open onto the front room with a fireplace and some soft furniture. There was a kitchenette, quartered off by a kitchen island, and a ladder that led up to the loft room that overlooked it. It was all very cozy and very rustic, and the tourists loved its country charm, as it said on his review page. It seemed that the crazy writer had transformed it into a disaster area. The carpets were stained, and by the way his boots crunched on them, Travis just knew he was going to have to rip it all out. The couch was flipped over, and one of the chairs was smashed to pieces. Some of those pieces were shoved into the fireplace, along with a hefty bag of trash and various other things. The fireplace was black with soot, the rockwork charred with ash, and by the smell, Travis thought the guy might have been cooking something in it. The kitchen was mostly okay. The refrigerator would need to be replaced, and the sink was full of sludge, but he thought the cabinets were intact, and until he got closer. That was when Travis noticed that every surface on the dark wood had weird runes scribbled into it, and would probably need to be ripped out. The ladder was still there, and as he climbed up to the loft, a smell met him before he got to the room. The walls were scribbled with the same runes and symbols, and the bed was stripped of its bedding and pillow top. That likely explained what had gone into the fireplace, but didn't explain why this guy had rubbed his excrement all over the bed. The mattress in the frame reeked, and Travis roared in rage as he realized that there was no saving that rustic bed frame, something that had run him about $4,000. He kicked the end table, the drawer popping in, only to slide slowly back out again. He shoved it, angry that it wouldn't go in, but realized something was stuck behind it. Dragging the drawer out, he found a manila envelope that someone had sealed up neatly and stuck in the back of the dresser drawer. He blinked, unsure of what it was. How had the cops not found this? It wasn't even hidden very well, and he would have surely seen it if it had been here before the writer arrived. It could only have been left by his latest tenant, and as he split the seal, he was curious about what he would find inside. Inside was a manuscript of about 120 pages and a salt and pepper mead binder. The front of the manuscript bore the same weird symbols as the cabinets and the walls, and to Travis, they looked like a weird combination of hieroglyphs and Nordic runes. Travis had a little more experience with runes. He'd hung around with some of the Odinists for the 12 months he'd been a guest of Stragview Prison, but the hieroglyphs were only a guess from the mummy movies he'd seen. The journal, however, seemed to be written in English at the start. Before he opened it, he decided to go out on the porch and sit on the swing, wanting to be away from the smell of the cabin. The first page was easy enough to read, the writing clean and clear. November 28th, day 1 of writing. Can't believe I got this cabin for so cheap. Couldn't even get a motel in town for this price. It's the perfect place to start my next book, and I'm excited. I brought my typewriter, the only real way to ply your craft, and I've set up a desk upstairs. From there, I can look over the forests and the mountains beyond. These sights will surely push me on as I write, and I'm hoping to be mostly done by the end of the week. I told my publicist to watch my social media, and I turned my phone off for the week before leaving it in the car. I want no distractions. November 29th, day 2 of writing. Well, if this isn't a surprise. I woke up this morning to find snow flurries. It's not sticking yet, but there's a weird wind blowing out there that makes me glad I brought my coat just in case. I brought the typewriter out onto the porch and was quite happy to be distracted by the falling snow. Even so, I wrote about 20 pages before I turned in for the night. Chapters 1 through 3 are sitting on the nightstand, and I'm pleased as punch about them. Ramsey Reed has found his latest case and has begun to chase the tail of this particular cat burglar. It'll be a great sequel to Ramsey Reed's first adventure. I sat on the porch till dark, listening to the moths as they smacked against the porch light. It's peaceful out here, the quiet night disturbed only by the sound of the snow coming down. I will truly be sad to leave this cabin, as weird as that sounds. I love my little apartment in the city, but out here, amongst the hills and the snow, it's truly spectacular. It's a little strange, though, as far up the mountain as I am, I felt like someone was watching me. Sitting on the porch, drinking tea and enjoying the quiet as I decompress, I could swear I saw something out in the woods around the cabin. It's just a shape, nothing definite, but being out here gives me hills have eyes vibes. I don't own a gun. I hadn't even thought to bring my knife, and when I went inside, I was very happy for the chain on the door. It looked thick and sturdy, and I hoped I wouldn't need it. November 30th, day 3 of writing. I finished another 20 pages today, and I'm glad I brought enough food for the week because I woke up to another surprise. I found the yard covered in snow, my car almost completely covered. The wind had blown it against the door deep enough to keep it from opening without a hard push. There must have been a real blizzard last night, which I seem to have slept through because the snow is easily 3 feet deep as I write this. I'm sitting in the living room watching it come down and wondering how long the power will last. It's holding firm, but I've seen it flicker a few times. I went ahead and had the steaks I'd been saving for Sunday, but if push comes to shove, I can put the rest of the meat in the snow, I guess. Despite the weather, I'm still impressed with how the book is coming. Ramsey has found the trail of his cat burglar, a true thief who's about to escalate in a big way, and soon their confrontation will be at hand. Speaking of confrontations, I saw someone again through the window. It's still in the woods, but it's clearer tonight. The moon came out, turning the falling snow into a field of diamonds, and I can see him at the edge of the woods, just watching the house. No, not the house, not really. He's definitely watching me. When I stare at him, I can feel him staring back. I thought about pulling the ladder up behind me tonight, but opted not to. I was not ready to give in to my paranoia, and the chains on the front door are pretty thick. December 1st, day 4 of writing. I only managed 15 pages today, the snow distracting me as it came down. I'm glad today that I brought the typewriter and this journal, because the power went out about noon. I found a grate under the sink in the kitchen that I can stick in the fireplace, and a big stack of wood out under a tarp out back, so I guess I won't starve. There's no way I can make it out to my little car. It's almost completely buried in the snow now. The road was hard enough to get up without snow, but now that the roads are icy, I'd be in for nothing but a quick trip to the ground if I tried. I had to move upstairs again. Writing in the living room makes me feel like something's watching me. Even during the daytime, I can feel eyes on me. It's very disconcerting. It's not as bad upstairs, but I had to move away from the windows, too. Something has noticed me in here, and I don't much care for the interest. I'll be pulling up the ladder tonight. Silly or not, I don't like the feeling of being watched. Travis sipped his coffee as he read the journal, more and more certain that it had been the writer's with each page. He did remember getting a refund from the power company for the power being knocked out up here, but it had only been for a couple of days, a week tops. The poor guy had probably had to cook over a fireplace till Monday or Tuesday of that next week, poor baby, and shiver under the extra blankets in the closet that night. Nothing to whine about, Travis thought. Trapped in a well-stocked cabin with a working fireplace and an amazing view sounded like a fine vacation to him. He flipped to the next page and read on. December 2nd, day 5 of writing. I cooked my first meal over the fireplace this morning. Fortunately, the owner left a cast iron skillet that I used to make eggs and bacon, and some toast that's a little crispier than I strictly like. I put all the meat in the freezer. It's been thawing slowly, but I think it'll keep it fresh for a few days given the weather outside. I only wrote a little today, 5 pages at best. I'm disappointed at the effort, but it was too bloody cold out there. I spent most of the day shivering under a thick blanket, jacket on, the cold eating at my bones. I stoked the fire, but it didn't seem enough. I had it blazing by bedtime, and that's how I caught my first good look at that creature that's been stalking me. I decided to get a good fire going and put the screen up, maybe building up some heat so I don't shiver my teeth out all night. I woke up a lot last night as I pulled the blanket around me, and it hurt my writing today. After getting it going, I put a bunch of logs on and turned to climb the ladder, when I saw a face in the glass. It was pale, too pale to be a person, and it was pressed against the window like a kid on a bus. It had long, greasy hair, its eyes the color of molten pennies. It stared at me, and as it saw me looking at it, it grinned, showing a mouthful of gravel-gray teeth. I screamed and almost fell off the ladder as I scrambled up it and yanked it up behind me. I sat on the floor after I got there, the firelight making shadows jump and jitter on the wall. In those lights, I could still see his face as he smooshed it against the glass. The thing could see me too. I knew it, and I pulled the covers off the bed and brought them around me as I sat watching it. As I write this, I've been looking up to peek at it, but my eyes are getting kind of heavy. I don't know how much longer I'll be awake to keep watch. Travis saw a long smear of graphite on the page and figured he'd lost the fight not long after. The tale was troubling, but Travis felt sure that his door would hold against if anyone tried to come in on the guy. He'd built those doors to hold up against bears when the cabin was empty. The doors were still there too, so unless the writer had been dumb enough to let the thing in, he'd be safe until the snow melted. The snow had actually melted some the following Tuesday before dumping another 5 feet on them over the coming weeks. The writer could have left by Wednesday at the least, so where had he gone? Travis read on, becoming intrigued by the mystery here. December 3rd. Can't really call this a day of writing. I didn't write a single page, not so much as a sentence. He was gone when I woke up, but I moved all the wood into the kitchen just the same. The whole time I could feel something watching me from the tree line, and I wished I had a gun. It's weird to write that sentence, but much less accept it as a statement of fact. I've always been staunchly opposed to guns, never so much as fired one, but I think I might be ready to rethink my stance after this. As I transferred the wood inside, I found something on the wood around the back door that made me think he'd been hanging around the house longer than just last night. The wood is marked with swirls and runes. The runes don't look like anything I've seen in fantasy books. These runes are angry, pagan-looking. I'm not even sure what he carved them with. The way they've been done makes me think he dug them out with his fingernails. It took up a lot of time inspecting them, and it distracted me from the feeling of being watched. The more I looked at them, the more they seemed to move and squirm. The story they told was something I couldn't decipher, but I could almost believe that, given enough time, I could have made some sense of them. The next thing I knew, the sun was setting, and I'd been looking at the wood for 8 hours. He came back again that night. I stoked the fire, but I scrambled into the loft without looking at the window. As I write, I can see him peeking in. His pale face is hard to hide, and I know he knows I can see him. I can almost believe that he's naked. I know he can't be. It's freezing out there, but I can see his bare shoulders and hands with no gloves on them. They're sitting against the window like pale starfish, and the fingers are just as pale as the moon. I'm wrapped in the blanket again, and the shivering makes my writing so uneven. What if this storm never ends? What if I'm stuck here all winter? What if I'm stuck here forever? December 4th, day 6 of writing. I managed 2 pages today, but I don't know how much more I'll be able to do. The story just won't come anymore. When I sit down and write it, I feel like such a fraud. It makes it difficult to string the words together. Am I even the same man who wrote Ramsey Reed's story? I'm devoid of ideas. I'm a hack. I can't keep writing this story. Better to turn it over to someone else. I don't deserve to write this story. I shouldn't have come here. This was a mistake. Frost talked about the bleakness of the forest and the harsh beauty of nature, but I thought it would help inspire me to continue this series. Instead, it's just shown me what a hopeless fake I am. Fake. Fake. Freak. 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 He had filled the rest of the page with the word fake or some misspelling of it. Travis could see that some of them had nearly gone through the page. By the date, he had written this Monday night, so tomorrow's entry, if there was one, would probably be him leaving and heading back to Kashmir. He'd feel like a real horse's ass as the weather rattled down and be on his way, though clearly that hadn't happened if the cops were still looking for him. Travis turned the page, and what he read made him blink. There was indeed another entry, but not what he had expected. December 5th. The snow is back and in force. It's blowing a proper blizzard out there, and all the windows are covered in frost. It does stop me from seeing the man, but it's also a little scary. I'm wondering when this will end, but I still can't see any end in sight. The snow's up to the door now, completely covering the porch. I can look through the front window and only see the top of the glass pane. I'm running out of food. I was supposed to leave this morning, placed clean, key under the mat, but I can't get out either door. I could climb out the loft window, but I'd still have to walk down the mountain. That seems like a bad idea in this blizzard. Luckily, I moved the wood inside, 'cause I'd have to tunnel out in order to get it now. The fire's burning, keeping some of the chill out, but it does little to turn the frost away from the windows. Despite the cold, he came back tonight. I could see him pressing his face against the top of the window, and I'm hiding under the covers as I write. It's all been a bit too much today. Travis furrowed his brow. That was wrong. The storm had ended Sunday, and the snow had been mostly melted by Tuesday morning. The temperature had been in the low 40s, unseasonably warm for the time of year, and the snow had stayed away until next week. There should have been no snow to hold him up. What was he talking about? Travis flipped to the next page, but the next 3 days were little more than footnotes. Until the 9th, that was. December 6th. Burned the last of the wood. Food running low. Cold creeping in. December 7th. So cold. Food running low. Burned the bedspread and the pillow top. It made a lot of smoke, but not much heat. I have another day's worth of food at best. The snow has to end, or I'll die up here. December 8th. Food is gone. Wood's gone. Smashed up the chair and burned it. No hope. No hope. December 9th. This may be my last testament, or my suicide note, or whatever you want to call it. I don't have much of a choice. I have to leave and try to walk down the mountain. I'm out of food, I'm out of fuel, and I'm out of options. I have to walk down the mountain to get some help. It's about a 5-mile hike through the snow, and I've taken all the provisions I can find. Water, the last of the food, which is 2 granola bars and a pack of trail mix, tube of toothpaste for emergencies, and those are my only supplies. I got my jacket and 2 pairs of pants on. If I don't come back, I hope someone finds this and looks for me come spring. Travis expected that would be the end, but there was more. A surprising amount of more. As he flipped through the pages, he could see that almost the whole book was full, though some of it were those weird scribbles he'd seen on the wall. The writer had apparently lived through the hike and come back to tell the tale, but Travis wasn't sure it was just him who had come back. The writing from here on was rougher, less neat, and he thought maybe something had happened on that hike. As he read on, he discovered that he was right. December something. I don't know how long I was in the snow, but somehow I'm back in the cabin. I woke up in the loft, lying on the floor without my backpack. I didn't dream the descent from the mountain. I can still remember it so vividly. I set out at morning, crunching through the snow, sinking up to my knees as I tried not to break a leg. I should have made town by afternoon, but the forest just went on and on. The snow was high enough that I dropped from the loft window and didn't get hurt, and it seemed to go on forever as I tried to make headway. As the sun set, I became aware that I was going to have to make camp out here, and I increased my plotting in hopes that I'd get there quicker. That was when I fell. Suddenly the snow was moving under me, and I was falling off the mountain in a jumble of arms and legs. I went above and then under, like a wave trying to hang on to its rider, and I blacked out before I came to a stop. I didn't expect I would ever wake up, just freeze to death like Jack Torrance at the end of The Shining, but I was not so fortunate. Someone found me. I woke up under the moonlight, and he was standing over me. He wasn't pale like I had thought. His skin was like ice, though still very much malleable. He was naked, as I had thought, but he lacked definition. He had no genitals, no nipples, no tone to his body or features other than his face. He was like a mannequin made of ice, and when he leaned down, I thought he was going to kill me. When he touched my forehead, and a lance of cold agony shot through me. I wished he had. I blacked out again, and when I woke up, I was here. It's getting dark, but I'm not cold anymore. I guess I'll just get some rest. First day of writing. I woke up today and felt inspired. The house is still snowbound, so I took out my typewriter and started writing again. I tried to write Ramsey's story as I'd done before, but the words don't seem important. There's a new story now, something different. It's about something older, something that lives in the woods, something that only comes with the snow. I started writing, but the words didn't look right. The words aren't right. The words aren't his words. I threw the typewriter into the snow and started writing by hand. Whatever that thing did when it touched me, it taught me how to write to him and tell the story that he wanted me to. It taught me how to write those weird scribbles that are over the back door, and now I can properly tell his story. Second day of writing. I'll use the old words here, just in case I happen to lose these new words. I wrote 50 pages last night, by hand. I haven't written that much by hand since high school, when Mr. Kimbler insisted that all our essays and dissertations be done by hand. If you speak the speak of the bard, then you must speak from the hand, not from the tapping of so many keys, he would so often say. I get it now. The human language, the language I once wrote in, cannot convey this story. People do not have words for the places and things he has shown me. The old words tell about things we cannot dream of, places and creatures and ideas so foreign that a sea slug at the bottom of the ocean might as well try to understand a car and how it works. I've been writing all day, writing all night, and I don't even think I'm a quarter of the way done. This may be the greatest work of my life. This may be the thing that ultimately destroys me. Third day of writing. I talked to the creature last night. I was writing, the pages really stacking up, when I heard someone knock at the door. It was the thing, that featureless thing that met me in the snow. He had a deer slung over one shoulder, a huge and bleeding buck, and when he came in, he threw it on the floor and just looked at me. I guess he didn't see any of the fear or uncertainty he'd seen before, because he asked me how my work was proceeding. He didn't say it like that, not necessarily, but I understood what he meant, and I nodded, showing him the pages. He said the deer was for me, and I realized that I hadn't eaten anything in 2 days. As I ate the deer, raw and oozing, he told me about him, the master we now both serve. I suppose I serve him. I seem to be serving him with every scrape of my pen, and to say otherwise would be false. He told me of his time, he told me of his home, and he told me of his enemies. I asked who he was, but he never gave me a name, and when he laughed, it sounded like glaciers colliding. You know him, Harold. He's chosen you, taken you as his chronicler, and if you don't know him by now, then he will surely destroy you before you can. We talked all night, and he left as the sun rose. I wrote this journal entry before my writing started for the day. I haven't slept since I came back. Haven't felt like I needed to. That should scare me, but it's honestly invigorating. My writing is becoming less coherent, at least where these words are concerned. I don't know how I feel about that. My words have always been what I have, my talent, and to lose them is scary. What I have found seems better, but it scares me too. It raw, primal, and the words are like the ones I saw on the back door before I knew them. I kind of want to go see what they are, but the house is almost completely under the snow now. I write in darkness, and yet I see. This house is like a tomb, but I think perhaps it's also a cocoon. I hope I'm the butterfly, and I might emerge changed. I pray it's not a wasp nest, and I'm a dead bug waiting to be eaten when the eggs hatch. Travis didn't like what he was reading. It sounded like this fellow was losing his mind. He had taken a spill out in the snow and had somehow gotten back home, and now he was slowly going cabin crazy. Travis still couldn't understand why. The day he was talking about had been sunny. The snow hadn't come back until the week after, and if Travis hadn't been visiting relatives in Asheville at the time, he'd have come up here to make sure the place was clean before the cops called to ask about this missing renter. That had been a whole mess, too. The man's editor had called when she hadn't heard from him by Thursday, and the cops had gone to do a well check and found the house destroyed. They had called Travis and started going over everything, but that had been a whole mess, too. The man's editor had called when she hadn't heard from him by Monday of the next week, and the cops had been unable to do a well check because of all the new snow that had started falling. They had gone up after a week of frantic calls in a snowmobile and found the house destroyed. They had called Travis and started going over everything, but that had been the start of this whole endeavor. Now it sounded like the guy had just sat up in his house and wrecked the place, maybe suffering from a concussion or some kind of mental break. Travis turned the page, but it just kept getting rougher. It started to look like charcoal marks, and the guy's new writing style only got sloppier. Travis didn't know who this mystery fellow was, but it sounded like the police might need to know about him. Travis had lived in Kashmir his whole life. Weird stuff was just kind of part and parcel for the town, but this was something else. The mountains had always been a place that Travis could come to get away from the weirdness for a while. They were a place he could hunt and fish and sit on the porch, hike the trails, and just forget about all the crazy stuff he lived with in town. As he read on, he started to feel the tickly feeling the writer was talking about. Suddenly, Travis didn't want to be on the mountain anymore. 4-day writing. He came back again. He brought meat, and I ate. We talked about the creature. And he read over my notes. He liked them, said I did good. He told me that he was once like me, person trapped in the snow until someone like him came and helped. He is Brogan, one of his helpers. I will be Brogan, he says, but I don't know if I believe. Made 70 pages, but there's problem. Am running out of paper. Pen stopped working today. but I held it over fire and got the ink to work again. Finding it difficult to make words today for journal, though my hands write the older words with much speed. These words feel stupid and heavy as I make them. The pen must be saved, so I will stop for today. Day. Burned pages of old story in fire. Old story not good. New story better. Paper gone. Am writing on wall now. Wall will be new book now. Hymn book. Words hurt head. Need right here, but hard. Watched pages burn. Felt nice to see. Pages old way. New story is new way. Day 3. It makes me spinny to write this, but I had to get some of myself again. I think it's been 3 days since I wrote, but I can't sure. Sometime in last few days, I've changed. I'm different. I'm like Brogan when I see him in woods. I'm smooth. Definition gone. I'm trying to get myself together, but I don't think I can. Must write stories. Must stop old words. Last entry. I'm in the bathroom, and I don't know how long door will hold. Earlier today, cut myself on pen as I wrote. I just did it again, and it clears my head some. Something came last night. It saw what I done and liked it. I'm bleeding pretty bad from my other hand, but I need to keep enough wits to write this down. He rode a horse and carried a sword. His eyes are fire. His skin green metal. Brogan say he is him. Green man. That now I go with them. I don't think I can say stop. I want go, but I want not. I will hide this somewhere for someone to find. If find, take to police. Let know what happened. I go with green. Travis jumped as he caught sight of something in his peripheral vision. He'd been so enthralled by the last few entries that the thing had damn near snuck up on him. Now it stood halfway between the woods and the house like a kid playing red light, green light. It was human-sized, naked and pale as the late afternoon sun beat down on it. Its hair wasn't straggly like the one the writer had described, cut into a short red flat top that was going wild quickly. His face was somewhere between doubt and a grin, like someone who's been caught but isn't sure whether you're going to scream or invite them in. He looked familiar somehow, like someone he'd passed on the street but never bothered to talk to. And as the minutes ticked by, Travis tried to remember who he was. All at once, he got it. He'd never met the guy in person, only talked to him on the phone a few times, but the police had shown him a picture from a recent speaking engagement at one of the colleges in the area. He looked different in his fresh flat top and charcoal suit, but the look on his face was an exact match. It was a look that said he was surprised to be here, but pleasantly so, and he was just waiting for someone to throw him out. It was the writer, or what was left of him. Before Travis could call to him, he backed away slowly, each step seeming like a cartoon skit. Before he stepped back into the woods, he tipped Travis a wink, and even from the porch, that wink was icy. It said that it was okay. They'd meet some other time. He'd see him again. It was just a matter of time, after all. Travis wasted no time in getting in his truck and leaving down the mountain. He would drop this journal off to the cops so they could start searching the woods again. He might stop at Roy Miller's Realty and tell him how he wanted this cabin on the market yesterday so he never had to come up here again. Hell, he might even stop at that new clinic in town, Dr. Winter's Forgetful Something, and see if they had any appointments available. Travis never wanted to think about what he read again, and he would never set foot in that cabin again for the rest of his life. My dad died nearly 2 years ago, and we just buried him today. He was a writer, though you've probably never heard of him. He was known in small circles, celebrated by the community where he lived, but his books will likely never grace the shelves of Barnes & Nobles. I say that like it's a fact, but that may not be the case anymore. Dad, much like one of those painters from the 1800s, became infinitely more famous in his death than he ever was in life. People who wouldn't return his calls, wouldn't even think of publishing his work, now come to see him from miles away. This probably seems strange, given that I just told you that he's dead, so let me start at the beginning. Dad died as he lived, at his keyboard. He's been writing the same book for as long as I can remember. It's a massive 7 or 8 volume series. In one of my earliest memories, I can remember toddling into his office and looking up at him as he smiled down at me, his fingers never leaving the keyboard as he plinked away. Dad wrote other things for magazines or freelance work, but the books were his magnum opus. He would tell anyone who would listen, usually interested friends of mine who were aspiring writers themselves, how the book would be the greatest work once it was done. He had envisioned 10 books in all, detailing the hero's journey of his main character as he attempted to find his father's murderer across several continents, meeting people and finding clues along the way. I've heard him talk about that book almost every day since I was old enough to understand what he was talking about, but I couldn't tell you much about them. He never let anybody read them. He was so protective of them. I don't know more than a dozen people who were aware of its existence at all. That being said, he was always in his study when he had time, tapping away at the keys and refining his manuscript for the day that it would be picked up by an editor. I was the one who found him, and it will haunt me for the rest of my life. I was getting ready for college, packing up my things, moving out, and I came to see if he would help me move some furniture onto the truck. He'd been in his office all day, and I kind of thought maybe he was mad at me. I know he didn't want me to leave. He was sad to see me go, but he had to understand that I had to go to college. I had a full-ride scholarship. I'd be a fool not to use it, and living on campus would give me access to resources I wouldn't have at home. It seemed like the best choice to move out, and I couldn't believe he couldn't see that. So when I stuck my head in and asked him, I was surprised when he didn't turn around. That only seemed to cement in my head the idea that he was mad at me. He had his back to the door, as he always did, fingers tapping away, and when he didn't say anything, I just stood there and looked at the back of his head for a moment. He had a bald spot forming, the hair receding away from the center, and I thought it was a little sad to watch my dad aging in such an obvious way. I asked him again, his fingers never slowing, but when he didn't say anything, I just went downstairs and managed to manhandle the desk into the U-Haul by myself. I decided I wouldn't bother him if he wanted to act like this. He would fold when it came time for me to leave, apologizing for acting like this, and we would have a hug before I drove off into the sunset. Around lunchtime, I looked at my now empty room and realized I was finished packing. Mom was at work at the post office, and I had planned to swing in and say bye on my way out of town. We had said our goodbyes that morning, with a lot of tears and hugging over breakfast, and Dad was the only one I still needed to say goodbye to. So I went upstairs again, saying I needed to leave and wondering if he'd give me a hug. His fingers just kept tapping away uninterrupted. "Come on, Dad," I said, stepping inside as he continued to ignore me. "I know you're bummed about this, but it's time for me to get out of here and make my own way. It's not like I'll never see you again. I'll be here for Thanksgiving. That's less than..." But when I put my hand on his shoulder, I noticed how cold it was. Dad had been up here for 3 days writing, and Mom said she didn't think he'd come to bed in all that time. That wasn't uncommon for Dad. He would hyperfixate on a project or revisions for days at a time. His office was towards the back of the house on the second floor, so without foot traffic or noise, he could lose himself for days as he worked. He usually came down for food after everyone was asleep, but I couldn't remember hearing him stumble around lately. I turned him towards me, his hands moving comically in front of him as he swung away from the desk, and as he came away, he began to scream as if someone was stabbing him. I stumbled away, taking in his long face and sunken eyes, and found myself running from the room as I grabbed the phone out of my pocket. Mom said she'd be home immediately, and as I waited downstairs, I could still hear him screaming in his office. She came home in a rush, going up the stairs 2 at a time, and when the screaming finally stopped, I breathed a sigh of relief. When she came downstairs, she asked me to come to his office. "I need to talk to you about something, and I think this should be a family decision." I came back to see that Dad was still staring at the screen of his MacBook, tapping away like we weren't even there. "I don't know how to explain this, but your father's dead." Looking at his fingers as they went about their tireless typing, I asked if she was kidding. Dad was clearly alive. His hands were moving, and I could see words on the screen forming coherent sentences. Were they playing a joke or something? None of what she was saying made any sense. I checked his pulse. He has no pulse, no vitals. He's gone, sweetie. But it appears that he's not quite gone. She tried to move him, and as she turned him away from the computer, I could see his lifeless face as it turned to regard me. His jaw had been hanging slack, his eyes open and staring, and as his hands came away from the keyboard, he started screaming all over again. It was deep and tortured, similar to the one he'd made before, and without even meaning to, I turned him back to the keyboard where his hands started typing again. I asked her what was going on, and Mom shrugged as she tried to come up with a reason for this. His book was important to him. You know that. I think maybe once he finishes it, he might stop on his own. I can't explain what's happening here, but I don't want him to die with his work unfinished. Your father kept saying it wasn't ready, but I'm going to send the first manuscript to his editor. Maybe once he sees it and someone puts it into print, he'll finally be able to rest. Either way, let's keep this between us, okay? I want your father to pass on without regrets, don't you?" I nodded, telling her of course I did. I wanted Dad to die in peace. "Then do him this last favor, and don't tell anyone what you've seen here. Promise?" I really didn't know how to feel about this, but I told her I wouldn't tell anyone, and she thanked me as she hugged me goodbye. I left in my U-Haul, unsure how to feel about the situation, but I kept the secret. I didn't come home for the next year. I came home for Thanksgiving, as promised, but the whole thing felt uncomfortable. Mom and I sat downstairs eating, her curious about how school was going, and me filling her in on my studies. As I ate turkey and tried to have a normal conversation over stuffing, all I could focus on was the tap-tap-tapping from upstairs. Mom had closed the door to Dad's office, something that I could never remember happening at any time in my life. But despite her best efforts, the tapping was still audible. There was a smell from the room at the end of the hall, and I was worried about her living in a house with a decomposing body. She said he hadn't decomposed much, but I think she might have been trying to spare my feelings. Worse than the smell, though, was the tapping. It never stopped. It sounded too loud to be from whole fingers. Despite this, Mom was in pretty good spirits. She said that Dad's first book was being edited, and his publicist thought it was likely to be ready for shelves by next year. He couldn't believe my dad had been keeping this gem to himself for so long, and I think that's when I really realized how few people Dad had shared his book with. She said the initial payment on the book had allowed her to pay some overdue bills, and she would send him the second book sometime next year. If I release them slowly, it won't seem so odd when he finishes, and I let them know that he's passed. I asked if his writing had slowed at all, and she said that he was typing all day and night. He never rests, and I've had to start sleeping in my noise-canceling headphones. The sound takes some getting used to, but I think I can put it out of my mind. I had meant to stay the week, but I ended up making excuses and leaving the day after Thanksgiving. The sound of the keys as they clicked away was becoming too much for me to handle. After that, I made excuses not to come home. I told Mom I had a paper due during Christmas and stayed on campus over the holiday. I took extra classes so I didn't have to come home on the semesters that I'd be able to take a break from. I still called her on the phone, but her conversations became shorter and shorter as time went on. The longer I was on the line with her, the more pervasive the clicking became, and it felt like I could hear it over the phone no matter where she was. Mom's mental state began to deteriorate as well. She'd sent the second book to his publicist, and he'd fast-tracked it after the first one had done so well. She deflected any sort of interviews or phone calls for Dad, telling them how shy and anxious he was, but people really seemed to want to pick his brain about the direction of the books, and they were becoming harder and harder to put off. She didn't sound like her usual self either. It was clear that she wasn't sleeping. She said the clicking was getting louder and louder the longer it went on. I tried to do some soundproofing on the office, but it never seems to help. I can't stand to be in there for very long. Even though he's looking at the screen, I can feel him watching me when I'm in there. I think I can hear something moving around at night, too. Mom took a deep breath, and I could almost see her looking in the direction of the office as she pitched her voice lower. I asked what she meant, afraid that maybe animals had gotten in to try to get at Dad's body, but she said it was just little sounds. You remember how he used to leave his office late at night to get food? Sometimes I feel like I can hear someone coming down the stairs in the wee hours of the morning. While I was listening to it the other night, I realized that I couldn't hear the keyboard anymore, and that scared me even more. She started crying then, and I think I had already decided to come home that weekend so we could sort this out. I hadn't come home in a long time, and I found a very different woman than the one I had found over Thanksgiving a year before. And why not? It had to be nerve-wracking, knowing you were sharing a house with a corpse. Mom looked like she had aged 20 years. Her hair, light blonde the last time I'd seen it, was threaded with gray and looked thinner than ever. Her skin sagged, and her eyes looked bruised from the bags under them. She was so thin to the point of emaciation, and I wondered if she had been eating. When she hugged me, I could feel her ribs pressing against me, and I decided then that something had to be done before I lost both my parents. I told her that we had to end this. I told her that we had to put him to rest, but she feebly resisted. He isn't done yet. He's still typing up there. I can't lay him to rest until he's finished. I asked her how long that would be, but she didn't seem to have an answer. I told her I was tired and wanted to rest, but after I heard her door close and the sound of her springs grumbling as she went to bed, I got up and went downstairs. I wanted to see what this thing was that was moving around after dark, and I knew just the place to hide. There was a small closet in the living room, a place for wrapping paper and old crafts Mom hadn't gotten around to yet. And after sliding some things around, I made myself comfortable and cracked the door. It took some time. I wished I had some coffee to keep me from dozing in the small, warm place. I was just starting to nod off, my phone showing 3:30 in the morning, when the landing at the top of the stairs creaked. Something glided down almost soundlessly, its body light as I pressed my eye to the slit in the door to see what it was. It was dark in the living room, the curtains drawn, but I didn't dare turn on my light. If it knew I was here, it might flee, and then I'd have nothing to report to Mom in the morning. Luckily for me, it jostled right past the closet door, and the creature was impossible to miss. It was thin, almost lacking dimensions, creaking as it ambled into the kitchen. I held my breath as it disappeared into the dim space, but the pale head was hard to miss. When it turned to look at the closet from the kitchen doorway, I feared I'd made a noise. When those empty eye sockets fixed on the door, I covered my mouth with my hands. When the creature creaked its way into the kitchen and disappeared from sight, I tripped out of the closet and made my way less than gracefully back up the stairs and into my old room. If it heard me, it didn't stop at the door to comment. Only then did I come to the same conclusion that my mother had, realizing what was missing from the silent house. The tapping had stopped. We called the police the next day, me threatening to call them myself if Mom didn't. I didn't know what that thing was I'd seen the night before in the kitchen, but I couldn't very well leave her alone with it. She just nodded and picked up the phone. I think she was ready to call them, honestly. She lived with Dad's corpse for 2 years, and even she had to agree it was time to end it. The paramedics weren't sure what to make of him, but he was definitely what I had seen the night before when it came into the kitchen. He had almost completely rotted, but his bones had moldering flesh still attached in places. His scalp had some hair clinging to it. The bald spot I had noticed was still visible, but we had taken his hands off the keyboard before they got there. When we had taken him from the computer, his scream was little more than a wheeze of protest. He had no vocal cords to scream with, but still, he protested. The police had questions, but I think Mom managed to convince them that it was all harmless. She said that when he died, she had just gone a little bit crazy. She couldn't cope with him being gone, so she just pretended he was in his office, typing away on his novel. I told them that that was what she had told me for months, and I think they believed me. Dad's remains were taken to the funeral home, and it goes without saying that his funeral was a closed casket affair. As we sat on the front row, though, I heard something that would haunt me until I went into the ground myself. Dad may not have been able to scream, but it seemed his work went on regardless. As I sat there with Mom, my mother sobbing as she heard the all-too-familiar sound, we both heard the low tapping of those bony fingers smacking against the lid of the coffin. I can only assume that they still press against the lid even now, my father's last story worn into the wood of his coffin.
We have to stop this. All of this. We have to stop writing, we have to stop reading, and we have to stop spreading these things around. As I sit here in my one-bedroom apartment, I can feel him looking at me. He's closer now. I can see him pacing in the corner. When he sees what I'm writing, I'm not sure what will happen. I've been writing these stories, these things, for so long. I've polluted the world with this filth, but I'm done. These stories, these abominations have ruined my life, like no drug or drink ever could. After tonight, though, I guess I'll never have to think about them again. I don't want you to think it's always been this way. I haven't always been a worthless waste of space. I was married once. I was married to an amazing woman who loved me. We had a little boy. We had a new house. I had a job that I loved. We had friends. We went out. We had a life together. That was before I found the creepypastas. I've always been a fan of horror. Horror films, horror comics, horror stories, pretty much anything scary. I remember when I was 6, I watched The Shining with my mom. While I didn't sleep at all that night, I remember relishing the squirming feeling that lived in my guts. From that day forward, I was hooked. I watched anything and everything. Even cheesy films like Paranormal Activity or The Haunting of Sunshine Girl seemed to pique my adrenaline. The darker the movie, the more it appealed to me. I guess that's why I liked them so much. If I was afraid, then my adrenaline was pumping, and it made me feel more alert, more alive. Horror movies are how I met my wife, Lisa. We were both standing in line at the midnight showing of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and began talking about horror movies as we waited to get our tickets. By the time we got inside, her friends had called to cancel, and I invited her to come sit with me. She was so cute, but turned out to be a total scaredy cat. She spent most of the movie hiding her eyes and squeezing my hand during the best parts. I didn't mind, though. I think I was in love by the end of that movie. 6 months later, we moved in together. To my surprise, we meshed well together. We didn't have the usual arguments over dinner or the division of chores. The house was brighter with her in it, and on our first anniversary, I proposed to her, and we made it official. My one-bedroom condo, our one-bedroom condo, I guess, was fine for a while, but when she told me she was pregnant, I knew it was time to find a bigger place. I do IT work for a pretty big company, so money for a house wasn't too big of an issue. With our modest incomes, we were able to get a nice 3-bedroom house in the city, and I put my condo up for rent. When our son was born, I thought it was the happiest day of my life. For a while, we were the picture of a happy family. Little did I know how quickly that would end. About 2.5 years ago, just as my son turned 2, a friend of mine told me about a new game on Steam called Five Nights at Freddy's. He knew I liked horror games, and he bought it for me as a late birthday present. I gave it a thorough playthrough, and though it was kind of cheesy, I felt like it was still an okay experience. The game, however, opened up a door I wished I'd left closed. I was so taken with the mystery of the game, the Bite of 82, the animatronics, the missing children, and it led me to search online for more info. That's how I stumbled across the creepypastas. They were great. How had I never seen these before? They were terrifying in a way I hadn't seen in years. I started with a classic, 1999, which was recommended because of the main character from the FNAF games, a giant bear. From the first time I read the story, I felt like there was something about it, something different. It prickled the hairs on the back of my neck, to be sure, but it also felt like something was watching me. I shrugged it off, just that scared feeling, like when you watch a really intense horror movie and for a day or so afterwards you feel on edge. I spent the next few months engrossed in any creepypasta I could find. Jeff the Killer, Slenderman Legends, Smile Dog, Candle Cove, that one was one of my favorites, The Blue Man, all the SCPs. After a while, I'm ashamed to say that they became a bit of a mania in me, and I absorbed anything that I could lay my hands on. When I learned that there were several channels on YouTube that read them aloud, I instantly subscribed to as many as I could find. I would eat through months, years of archives in one sitting, and with my headphones on, I felt immersed in a world of darkness that no horror movie could simulate. The creepypastas created a world in my mind that no Nightmare on Elm Street or House of a Thousand Corpses could rival. It seemed like, when I had time, I was always listening to them, ignoring anything else. That's when things started to get really bad. It started with insomnia. I was plagued with nightmares that would wake me up several times a night. I'd wake up, certain there was something in the bedroom with me, but a frantic sweep would find nothing except a grumpy wife being woken up yet again by my nightmares. It got to the point where I was lucky to get 5 hours of sleep a night, then 4 hours of sleep, then 2 if I was really lucky, then 2, but only if I took sleep aids or drank myself into oblivion. My wife made me go see a doctor. He put me on medication, but that didn't work either. Then, at her wit's end, she made me sleep on the couch. That only escalated my night terrors, though. That feeling of being watched got worse and worse, and I started seeing something out of the corner of my eye as I listened to my stories. As I sat awake, using the fear to keep myself from nightmares, I would see the shadowy something as it huddled in the corner. It would creep closer and closer, just out of my sight, but always in the peripherals, until I'd snap my head around, and it would vanish. I started having trouble at work. I was always tired and short with my coworkers. One day the boss told me just to not bother coming back. My wife was furious, finally told me that it was my family or the scary stories. We argued, but my heart really wasn't in it. I, too, had come to understand by then that the stories were the problem. The stories were keeping me awake. The stories were keeping me amped up. The stories were making me paranoid. I needed to work. I needed to be a father. So I did the only thing that made any sense. I gave them up, cold turkey, at least for a while. I lasted all of 2 months. Without the stories, I started to slip back into a normal routine. I was getting to sleep on time. My job let me come back on a trial period that quickly became permanent. My attitude improved, and I was once again the man I had always been. It's funny, though, how we forget what set us down the bad path once we're back in the light. It was just a little bit at first, on my phone at work, then after my wife went to bed, or when I was on the toilet, and slowly the night terrors came creeping back in. I had relapsed hard, and before I knew it, I was listening to them all the time again. That's when my wife took our son and left for her mother's house. The nightmares got worse, and suddenly I wasn't sleeping at all. My temper would flare unexpectedly, and that was the last straw for my newly returned job. My friends tried to help me, but I became moody and unpredictable. Soon they stopped coming around too. I started drinking again, drinking to black out, to feel a few moments of blissful oblivion. My wife filed for divorce, unable to help me, and unwilling to watch me kill myself with these stupid stories. My parents stopped calling, agreeing with my wife that if I wouldn't stop on my own, they didn't want anything to do with me. Then, one day, I realized the stories were all I had left. Or so I thought. About a year ago, the stories weren't enough. I could see the thing in the corner of my eye more and more often, stalking me. One day, for no reason at all, I started writing my own stories. I'd never been a writer, far from it, but the act of writing worked as its own kind of talisman against the creature. Writing them seemed to keep them at bay, seemed to get the darkness out of me, and for a while things got better. I was getting 5 hours of sleep again. I was feeling better than I had in a long time, but the writing became just as much of a mania as the reading. The divorce proceedings went badly for me. She got the house, of course, and child support, and a lot of other things I would have fought for once. I didn't care. None of it mattered to me. All I cared about was the thing in the corner of the courtroom that kept growling and pacing. All I wanted to do was get this over with so I could get home to my writing. I moved out, went back to the condo we used to live in, and took odd jobs to keep the bills paid. I've sold blood, sperm, written terrible things for terrible people, and all to feed my addiction. I'm no better than some smack addict, no better than some worthless junkie who writes his fix every day. My wife keeps calling me, asking when I plan to see our son, who keeps asking where his daddy is. But I don't have time for them. I have to write. I have to keep this beast at bay. But now, even the writing has stopped working. The thing isn't in the corner of my eye anymore. I can see him now. He's not even trying to hide. I'm afraid that he's very close to having me. God forgive me. He's stalking forward right now, and I can see his paws or feet or whatever they are as they make little divots in the carpet. I can smell his rancid breath as he grins with his lipless mouth full of teeth. So, what's the point of this then? Why write a creepypasta about creepypastas? For some kind of macabre immortality within a world I once loved? To have one more hurrah before the end? No. I'm writing this for you, for the ones who may be reading this after I'm gone. Always remember, if you remember nothing else, that these tales are spun from darkness, that the thing you feel watching you when you create fear is real. It can and will get you if you let it. While you stare long into the abyss, know that it stares hungrily back at you. His face is inches from my throat now. I can finally identify the brimstone in his breath.
I am a murderer. I'm responsible for the deaths of 75 within 2 weeks. I've stabbed men to death, rendered bodies to ash, killed children in the womb, and even drowned whole ships at sea. I've changed the fate of kingdoms and seen to it that uncharted planets remained unfound. I would likely be the most prolific serial killer in the United States, if not for one problem. The police claim that if murdering fictional characters was a crime, they'd have to jail Stephen King and George R. for multiple life sentences. They say this as they laugh me out of the police station. They think it's a joke, or that maybe I'm not right in my head. But I can assure you, I'm as right as I've ever been. I listened to them tell their stories for years, and I've heard them scream when I end their lives. I'm a murderer, pure and simple, and their blood is on my hands. You're probably reading this, though, and thinking that I'm ready for the rubber room. Let me start from the beginning. I've always been a creative mind. When I was younger, I could hear them whisper to me about their homes, their verdant green kingdoms, their sterile, majestic spaceships, the feel of rolling decks beneath their feet, and so much more. It manifested in my games, and my school friends would always gather around to see what today's adventure would be. We traveled the cosmos, fought wars between elves and men, and roamed imaginary prairies as we hunted wrongdoers on horseback. As I grew older, the voices grew louder, more insistent, and their stories became my stories. I wrote about the kingdoms of my youth, the adventures of my childhood, and by the time I was 20, I had 5 books published, even one on the New York Times bestseller list. As I grew, so grew my fame. My writing was prolific, and all the while the voices told me their stories. I took my readers to fantastic places, and their patronage allowed me to live quite well. By the time I was 30, I had a home and a family and enough published work to fill a bookshelf. That's when the problems started. It all started with Aberdeen Price, dashing archaeologist adventure. He told me of his next adventure, a trip to the city of Bone. However, I was working on something else at the time, and didn't want to divert efforts away from my current project. So I wrote some notes and promised myself I would sit down and give him some time when I was done. This apparently wasn't good enough for Aberdeen. He came every night in my dreams and told me his story over and over and over again, until finally, I just couldn't take it anymore. I stopped what I was doing and diverted all my attention to writing his next book. It was a hit, a bestseller, and the biggest mistake of my life. You see, this showed the voices that they could get what they wanted by badgering me. Every night from that night on, they would come to me and tell me their stories, each overlapping the other, until I just couldn't take it anymore. The kingdom of Verdant Green was once at the mercy of the dark wizard Zormuth. His evil armies threatened to... Scanners once more alert Kevin Gorel that he is nearing his destination. The dark planet Zephyr rises from the darkness of space as he see the island of Katmandil off the starboard side of Elizabeth's Folly. The shore is quiet, but Captain Cree can once again see the natives amongst the trees as he hears his quarry. The elusive Dr. Burton will strike again this night, and I will be ready to... Their voices towered in my mind like the screams of children as they tried to make themselves heard. That was my first mental breakdown, and my worst. My wife arrived home in time to save me from bleeding to death. They put me in an institution for 3 weeks after that. Lisa thought it was all the strain of my busy writing schedule. The strain of writing so much must have just become too much for you, she said, as she stood by my bedside and looked down with pity for her poor, brilliant husband. She had no idea. The worst part wasn't the IVs or the sedatives, the shitty TV, or the staying in a room for 24 hours a day, the sounds of sorrow from down the hall, even the constant itching from the healing cuts on my arms. It was the week and a half I spent with my hands in restraints. Without my hands, I couldn't write. Without writing, there was no way to stop the shrieking harpies in my brain from driving me insane. It took me a while to convince them that writing was a kind of therapy for me. The battle was made all the harder by my wife's constant arguments about how the writing had put me here in the first place. After a week and a half of no change, they had begun to see that I might be making some sense. I began to write again, and the changes were noticeable. I started sleeping, became less hostile, finished my meals, and a month later I was ready to go home. The voices started ramping up again almost immediately. By this point in my career, I had 7 stories running on and off. That's a lot of voices trying to be heard. I tried to keep up with them, but I could feel my sanity slipping again as they screamed for my attention day and night. By my 2nd week home, my wife was ready to have me committed all over again. I'd stop sleeping and would lock myself in my study for days to make the voices stop for even a few minutes. That was when my first murder took place. That's not to say that no one had ever died in my stories. Characters die in stories, that's the nature of storytelling. But this was the first time I'd ever deviated from the path set forward by the voices. Detective Sam Umbridge was coming to the climactic end of his latest crime novel, and the shootout with the killer was becoming heated. I had meant to write that Dario West, the antagonist of the novel, was struck by Sam's bullet as he leaned around the doorframe. Before I knew what I'd done, though, I had written the death of beloved gumshoe Sam Umbridge instead. I had moved on to the next sentence before I caught my error, but it was too late by then. He died in my head with a gut-wrenching scream, and just like that, his voice was mercifully silent. For a moment, all the voices were silent. It was as though they had all seen what I had done in my manic state. I cleaned up the draft a little bit before sending it off, Sam and Dario had killed each other in the shootout, and Sam had died victorious. Fans hated that Detective Sam Umbridge would never make another appearance on their shelves, but they accepted it. The end was widely praised by fans and critics alike, an all-around success. My agent even called to congratulate me on the climax of a much-beloved series, and asked if everything was going all right with me. Last time we talked, you sounded as though you were a little shell-shocked. I guess I wasn't shocked now that I think of it. The process really made me think. Why not kill what was driving me crazy? I didn't have to kill them all, just enough of them to make the voices quiet down a little. Like any prolific serial killer will tell you, it's hard to stop once you've started. Before I quite realized what I'd done, I'd ended them all. I ended my 8-book fantasy series with the death of the entire court and the eventual fall of the protagonist in his order. I watched as Kelvern Gorel flew his ship and crew into the phantom night where certain doom awaited, and he would never be heard from again. After sinking the ship of his arch-rival, I had the Spanish Armada sink Elizabeth's Folly with all hands aboard, while Captain Cree floated atop the waves after taking a sword to the belly. I dropped a tomb on the head of Aberdeen Price, the one who had started my descent, and made the ruins he was exploring his own tomb in turn. I killed them all, one by one, and the fans were livid. How could you just kill them? Why wouldn't you simply end the series on a high note? Why did they all have to die? I toyed with the idea of ending their series, but I knew that it wouldn't work the moment I thought of it. They were never my stories in the end. They were only my stories to tell. If I left them alive, they would always want one more adventure. Killing them was all I could do to stop my descent into madness, and as I lay down to sleep that night, I felt myself smile at the thought of my long-awaited sleep. It never came. I've been staring at my sleeping wife for the past 7 hours as I keep court with the whispering dead. Their spirits are unwilling to die, the part of my soul I put inside them reluctant to be put to rest. It's only now that I see the folly of my actions. The dead, you see, are not to be satiated with adventures or the continuing joy of existence. They moan, they wail, they bemoan the lives and the loves that were taken from them. At first, it was only for me that I wept. Now I see that this curse won't end with me. You see, I was watching my daughter as she played in the park yesterday. She played in the sandbox, her dolls and her brother's action figures out on an adventure of her own creation. I watched her going about her games of make-believe as I sat in a daze. When I asked her about it over lunch, she told me a story about knights and castles, people hunting for dragons, and brave warriors protecting those in need from harm. It was a story just like the ones I had made up as a kid. The kingdom was similar to the one I had left in ashes. I beg you, anyone out there who hears the whispers, don't pass the gift to others. It must end with us, and never darken the mind again. I must keep my own vigil now. I must watch my own daughter now, before the madness takes hold. I can't let the whispers have her too, even if it means the death of another of my creations. I won't let the madness have her.